Good morning, everybody. It is Tuesday, July 18th. Welcome to the Montgomery County Council. We have a lot going on today at the council. A lot of policy discussion that will be taking place over the next number of hours. But we are going to start our day with a proclamation commemorating Peace Day in honor of Maddie J.T. Stepanik's life and legacy. And that proclamation will be led by council members Katz, Albernaz, and Luedtke.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. If we've ever needed Peace Day in Montgomery County, today is the day for it. I did want to, beyond my colleagues who are here, we have Jen Lynn, who is very well known in Montgomery County, and this young lady is Leanne Smith. Now I've been told that you say it Leanne, right? Because she has the distinction of being Jimmy Carter's niece, and we're going to hear from her, and she's going to explain the peace symbol in a moment. But and we're going to hear from my colleagues as well, and then we have a proclamation. We are a mosaic of gifts to nurture, to offer, to accept. This quote was written by Maddie J.T. Stepanik, a young man that gave so much to our community and our world in such a short amount of time. Matthew Joseph Thaddeus, known as Maddie J.T. Stepanik, was born July 17, 1990, and began writing poetry at the age of 3, which he referred to as heart songs. Maddie was an accomplished American poet and published 7 best-selling books of poetry and peace essays. Before his tragic death at the age of 13, Maddie had become nationally known as a peace advocate and motivational speaker, all while suffering from a rare disorder longer than I can pronounce. In 2011, Oprah Winfrey names Maddie as one of her all-time, this is Oprah Winfrey saying this, as one of her all-time most memorable guests in the 25-year history of her show. In fact, Maddie convinced Oprah not to retire from the show when its 20th anniversary through an email saying, and I'm quoting, "It's good for the world and good for Oprah not to retire." His hero was former President Jimmy Carter, who described Maddie as the most extraordinary person whom I have ever known. To honor Maddie, there is a Maddie J.T. Stepanik Park, which is a 26-acre park located within King Farm in Rockville. The park was dedicated in October 2008 at the park. You will see a life-size bronze statue of Maddie and his service dog, Micaiah. This past Saturday, many of us, had the honor of attending Maddie J.T. Stepanik Peace Day of gathering at the park. It was extremely moving, to say the least, and powerful event celebrating Maddie's birthday and peace legacy. Shortly after Maddie's death, citizens in his King Farm neighborhood established the volunteer-based, not-for-profit Maddie J. Stepanik Foundation with the mission of making Maddie's message accessible to everyone. To learn more about Maddie and the Maddie J.T. Stepanik Foundation, please go to www.maddieonline.com. And now we're going to hear from Councilmember Albernaz, Councilmember Luedtke, and then we're going to hear from Leanne, and then Jenny Stepanik as well. With that, Councilmember.
Thanks so much, Councilmember Katz. So Peace Day and this event is one of my favorite events every year in Montgomery County. It's an extraordinary opportunity for us to come together. And from 1999 to 2003, I had the distinct honor and privilege of working at Children's National Medical Center. And I actually met Maddie and Jenny at that time. Maddie was a celebrity at the hospital, loved by everyone, the staff, the volunteers, and you could immediately sense a presence from Maddie, a wisdom that went well beyond his years. And you felt truly at peace in that presence. And that peace has never been more important than right now. Our country feels like it's on fire, and the forces trying to divide us will not succeed because of people like Maddie, because of communities like Montgomery County, because of leaders like Jenny Stepanek, who have made sure that Maddie's legacy will never be forgotten. On a lighter note, I recently bought a bumper sticker that said, "Less honkin', more tonkin'." We need to make sure that here in Montgomery County, that we are and will continue to be a model of civility, a model of trying to work together even when we have very distinct and passionate differences, so that we can all live in harmony. And so thank you, Councilmember Katz, for putting this very important proclamation together, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
I did not have the opportunity to meet Maddie while he was with us, but I was an avid listener of the Jack Diamond Morning Show, and I would get extra excited whenever Maddie would be on the show, because as soon as you would hear his voice and as soon as you would hear the profound things that would come out of this small child's mouth, you couldn't help but believe that you were listening to an angel who was placed here on earth. And it would fill you up. And one of the things I love the most about Maddie's Heart Songs is not just the significance of the message, but that they did, in fact, and remember this was a child writing this, recognize the humanity in all of us, recognize that humans are not perfect, but give you a roadmap for moving forward in a positive fashion. That is his legacy, and it is a beautiful one. And from time to time, we all are humans, we all need to go back and revisit that and hit pause and take that moment when you feel upset, hurt, wronged, and go back to that to find a center, to find a grounding again. I urge you all to visit the park over at King Farm. It's a beautiful place and space, and it is newly bedazzled. Again, after this weekend's Peace Day event with little hearts and rocks that have been strewn all about, go find some, go take some time to reflect. And I want to thank Jenny for her tireless work in making sure that peace is a part of our everyday life, and in persistently giving of herself back to our community. You are a treasure. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Leanne Smith from Plains, Georgia, and I do stretch my words out a little bit. Or so I've been told since I got up here in this neck of the woods. But I didn't get to know Maddie either, but over the years that Jenny lived in Americus, Georgia, which was only about 10 minutes from me, I saw this wonderful lady full of spirit and peace signs, no less, which I love, whizzing around the streets, coming to every event that was possible, always with a smile on her face and an uplifting word for anybody that was there to listen. She later asked me to be on the foundation, the Maddie Foundation, and I was very honored to do that. Jimmy Carter is my uncle, Rosalind, and my dad, and her name is Rosalind. She's named after somebody in our family named Rosa. Is my aunt, so by marriage, I'm related to Jimmy Carter as a niece. Well, when they put him in hospice, or he came home that Saturday, I just had this kind of meltdown moment of who was going to do all the things that he did to carry on peace throughout the world, because, you know, I'm kind of partial and I'm thinking, you know, this is my uncle and he's wonderful and I love him to death and he does all this good. But what happens from this point on? So later that afternoon, I called Jenny in my meltdown stage and I'm like, Jenny, well, I don't know what to do. I mean, I'm seeing this is more than I can bear at the moment. And she just said over the phone that it's our place to fill in his shoes and to carry on peace and love and empathy and compassion for all the people that are around us, because we all are equals. And that's what my uncle truly believed, and that's what Maddie believed. And I think that that's how they came together. And I think that that's now our job, is to carry on their legacy and to share peace however we can possibly do it, whether it be speak to somebody at the grocery store or hang a peace sign on the front door. I hung 18 of these that week, and it went snowball through the news, and now I've done over 300. And they're hanging, and it just says, you know, spreading peace with Uncle Jimmy on the back. So it doesn't matter, big or small. It can be a smile. But we just need y'all working with us to help spread Maddie Stepanek and Jimmy Carter's message of peace, because it is possible. It's very much so possible. And I appreciate being invited, and I've enjoyed my trip here, and I will be back now that I know how to get here.
And as they say, come back often, you hear? Yeah.
And y'all come see us.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you, Leanne. And she's right. Peace is for all generations. Like, you've got this, I think when Maddie and Jimmy were good friends, he was in his 80s, and Maddie was like maybe 10 years old when they finally met. And they became best friends. I want to say, first of all, thank you, Council Member. I want to say Sydney. Council Member Katz, I'm being official here. And the County Council, and the entire county in Montgomery County, Maryland, for choosing year after year, to say peace matters. Peace does matter, and it's easy to remember peace when we go to the Peace Day. All right, we have the Peace Day, and Maddie's Foundation provides you at no cost this opportunity to come together and get to know your neighbors, get to know your elected leaders, people who want to be leaders, people who are the children that are sometimes annoying you and like running through your garden, but get to know your neighbors, get to know how we are the same and that we have some similar needs, get to know what the needs are so we can tend to basic needs and be okay, and play together, talk together, be together. So we offer this event and hundreds of people come and they do arts and crafts and listen to music, and then we go on to the next day. And that's what matters, is the next day. What matters is after Jimmy Carter, after Maddie Stepanek, after we finish proclaiming peace right now, and you all have a heavy agenda today that could devolve into something that's not kind. I want everybody to remember that peace is possible. Peace is not perfection. Peace is not a destination. It is a journey. It is purpose. We can always, in fact, not we can, we will always have conflict. We are always going to disagree. There's going to be something that we can't agree on. But we can also always be kind, considerate, respectful. We can agree in ways that we are not hurting each other, not attacking each other, and we are still taking care of basic needs of every person in our city, our county, our state, and our world. Because when our basic needs are met, we can be okay. And if I can be okay, I'm not scared, I'm not hungry, I'm not lacking hope and purpose, I can then look at you and say, are you okay? And this is where Maddie took it to the next level. Are we okay? I need to be okay. I need to make sure you're okay, but we all need to make sure that we are okay together. So have a good meeting. Remember, peace is possible, and rise to that occasion. Thank you. Mama, peace out.
And as we read this proclamation, Jenny, I can say that the one thing that everyone can agree on is that we love you and Maddie. Could we get another round of applause for her, please? We have a proclamation from the Montgomery County Council, whereas Maddie J.T. Stepanek, born July 17th, 1990, was a 7-time New York Times best-selling author, lyricist, and American poet, and before his death at the age of 13, he became known as a peace advocate and motivational speaker, and
whereas Maddie wrote 6 volumes of poetry on heart songs, which he described as gifts that reflect on each person's unique reason for being, as well as a collection of peace essays, all while living with a rare and fatal health condition called dysautonomic mitochondrial myopathy. Whereas Maddie wanted to be remembered as a poet, a peacemaker, and a philosopher who played and made a difference to millions of people by his writings, TV appearances, and music albums. Oprah Winfrey named him one of her all-time most memorable guests in the 25-year history of her show, and a messenger for our times. And
Whereas Maddie was a deeply spiritual and religious young man who believed his purpose was to be a messenger of hope and peace around the world, and that peace is possible, peace is for all people, peace can be taught, and peace begins with deliberate choices in attitude and action. And whereas in honor of Maddie's contributions, a congressional resolution was passed in 2014 to support the Maddie J.T. Stepanek Foundation's National Peace Day campaign to have Maddie's birthday annually proclaimed as a day to learn about and celebrate peace. And
whereas in commemoration of his life and legacy, a 26-acre namesake park and playground with a statue and a peace garden was created in 2008 in his King Farm neighborhood and the city of Rockville in partnership with the Maddie J.T. Stepanek Foundation annually celebrates Maddie's Peace Day in July. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the County Council of Montgomery County, Maryland, hereby recognizes July 17th as Peace Day in honor of Maddie J.T. Stepanek's life and legacy of peace, which continues to gently shape our world with hope and goodwill. It's presented today, and it's signed by my colleagues, Councilmember Albernaz, Councilmember Lukey, Council President Glass, and myself. And we congratulate all. We're going to get a picture taken. So you all come down and get
Thank you very much, colleagues, for that meaningful and moving presentation. As was said, we could all use a little more peace in our lives, and we need to continue striving to be our better angels, especially in the political discourse and in public policy conversations. And let's try to remember that as we continue today's very important conversation as well. And as we took this morning to remember the memory of Maddie Stepanek, I also want to extend the council's condolences to the family of Mark Hansen. Mark Hansen was our longtime county attorney who had been in the county attorney's office for nearly 4 decades. And he retired in January of 2022 as the longest serving county attorney. And he served with respect and dignity and an intellect that helped all of us here in Montgomery County implement our laws and be thoughtful about the laws we implement. And so if we can take a moment of silence to honor the memory of Mark Hansen, thank you. Okay, thank you very much. We are now moving on to general business. Madam Clerk, do we have any announcements?
Good morning, Mr. President, Vice President, Council members. We have one announcement today. There's an addition to today's agenda. Item 2O has been added, a special appropriation to the FY24 operating budget, Montgomery County Government, Office of the County Executive, in the amount of $198,594. Community Use of Public Facilities, $60,000, and Department of Health and Human Services, $20,000 for summer and after-school youth safety program. The source of funds is state grants. A public hearing and action are scheduled for July 25th. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. There are no minutes for our approval, so we are going to move straight into Legislative Day 22. And call of bills for final reading. And the first bill for final reading is Bill 2423, Air Park Community Advisory Committee established. I will say that as Chair of the Transportation and Environment Committee, we took up this bill on June 26th. And the bill establishes an advisory committee to advise the county executive, the county council, the revenue authority, and residents on the work and impact of the Montgomery County Air Park operations. The bill was introduced by Councilmember Luedtke, with co-sponsors being myself, Councilmembers Jawando, Albernaz, Katz, and Sales. There were several amendments that were made during the committee work session. Among those amendments, they would require a report for the number of touch and go flights and the facilities planning operations at the air park. And they would also adjust the membership of the Air Park Community Advisory Committee to specifically include nearby communities and also pilots who use the air park and nearby related aviation businesses. The committee voted 3-0 and recommends the bill with amendments. Ms. Oconee?
Good morning and thank you, Council President, and good morning, Council members. Thank you for that introduction and for that broad overview. Before going, because the T&E committee unanimously recommended the bill with the amendments, so we of course should walk through each amendment for a decision point by the council. Before doing that, I did just want to draw attention to the summary of impact statements, which is at page 3 of the staff packet. And I should mention at the outset, I'm stepping in for Ms. Wellens, who did all the heavy lifting, prepared the packet. I'm simply stepping in on her behalf. So at page 3 of the staff packet, you have a summary of the impact statements. There was none of the impact statements noted any significant impact, whether it was the racial equity and social justice impact statement, the climate assessment, economic impact. On the fiscal impact, it was noted in the report that establishing an Air Park Community Advisory Committee is expected to have minimal impact on county expenditure. I would propose that we, I can walk through the various,
I'm not sure if we need to go through
Okay.
all of the pieces of legislation. It was pretty straightforward.
Sure.
So if that's all you want to report out, and recognizing the important work that Ms. Wellens has done, and just for public understanding, Mark Hansen, the former county attorney, is Ms. Wellens' father, and so that's why she is not here today. But with that, I'll turn it over to the bill sponsor
Sure.
to fill out the conversation. Councilmember Lutke.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank all of the residents who started advocating for this and for having this committee before we even got sworn in. And as you'll recall, we were sworn in a week after the plane ended up in the electrical tower. So that was hot on everyone's mind, of course, right as we were inaugurated. There have been a bunch of different issues that I have been asked about. I know other council members have been asked about over time related to noise and safety issues regarding the air park's usage. For instance, I met separately with residents. I've met separately with the NAACP's Montgomery County chapter last month to talk about that, because some of those members live in or around the air park and had questions. So there's a definite desire from different communities around the air park area to get this committee up and running so that it can talk through proposed solutions, in particular to mitigate noise. And I want to thank all the bill's co-sponsors, Council President Glass, Albornoz, Councilmember Jawando, Councilmember Katz, and Councilmember Sales, as well as Councilmembers Balcom and Stewart for the T&E session that we did, and for the good conversation at committee working through the proposed amendments. And I also want to thank Keith Miller from the Revenue Authority for taking the time to meet with us and to discuss how best to move forward in a way that's workable for everyone. So to recap this, there was a prior committee or commission, the Air Park Liaison Committee, that started in 1990 and then was disbanded around the same time during COVID, that the particular type of touch and go operations that produce the most frequent flyovers in that immediate residential area started to increase. And that's based on data that was provided to the county through Vianair, who was a consultant hired by the county to do a report that was commissioned last year. And it has also coincided with the fact that there have been increased noise reports related to air park operations as well. And while the county government, I want to make this very clear, the county government does not have any direct authority over flight operations. That is the province of the FAA. The advisory committee and having this available, these are commonplace in areas that surround airports. And large and small around the country, everywhere. And it's important to help synthesize community voice and business voice around these issues and have a place to gather that information. And I know that, we have to take this opportunity to make sure that we are able to then take what this group does and surface it further to the state and to the FAA. So I appreciate having this reinstituted, albeit in a new form. I do view the air park as an important resource and economic development tool, and I believe that this committee can serve as a conversation for that as well. So thank you all for your suggestions, your support, and thank you, Council President.
Thank you, Councilmember Lutke. Councilmember Sales.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to Councilmember Lutke for bringing this bill forward. I was proud to co-sponsor this bill during its introduction and recognize the tremendous needs for its passage. The Montgomery County Air Park, as Councilmember Lutke said, is an integral part of our local economy that needs and deserves proper oversight and community engagement. One of my biggest concerns about this bill is community feedback and input. When creating a committee like this, we must have members that are well informed about the issues raised by the air park. I'm glad that amendments to this bill will make the committee more geographically representative of the area. But as staff noted, it might be worth it to add more language specifying that geographic diversity means positions around the air park. And so I don't know if language was added, additional language, or if that
you
will
want to
be
restate
done
the
later.
question, Councilmember?
Yes, so, well, in the staff packet, staff noted that it might be worth it to add a small amount of language specifying that geographic diversity means positions around the park. Because there was a discussion of east versus west.
So the additional amendments that were made, and these are at page 4 of the staff packet, and the first amendment actually titled Membership Amendments. The double underlined language represents what was added, and there was specifically, so the 8 voting members include 3 members. Previously, it said nominated by other homeowners associations, civic associations, or community groups. Following the committee work session, there's an amendment. The proposed amendment is to add who reside within a 3-mile radius of the air park and who represent the geographic diversity surrounding the air park. So that amendment was included.
Okay, good. Okay, all right. Well, thank you again for the language, and look forward to passing this bill.
Thank you. Councilmember Albornoz.
Thanks. I just wanted to double tap on thanking the community's engagement and thoughtful advocacy throughout this entire process. But I also do want to thank the Revenue Authority, who I think has been very open to and willing to engage the community in a way that's authentic and addresses issues on the front end. I also want to acknowledge my former Chief of Staff, Joy Nurmi, who worked very closely on this issue before she retired, and was excited to see that Councilmember Lutke had proposed this particular piece of legislation and texted me saying quickly, you got to co-sponsor this. So I am, this is a good example of where coming together to come up with reasonable solutions to address real issues, I think is beneficial to our entire community. So I look forward to passage of this piece of legislation.
Thank you, colleagues, and I also just want to extend my appreciation to Councilmember Lutke for introducing this bill, and incredibly important to note or double tap what she said for doing that, that there are a number of issues related to the air park that are not in our jurisdiction. It is under the domain of the Federal Aviation Administration, and federal authorities, and our work and partnership with the Revenue Authority and our federal delegation as well, who have all been plugged in to this important conversation, are really working to make sure that the pilots, the businesses, and most importantly the residents all feel safe and respected with those operations as they continue. So again, thank you, Councilmember Lutke, for that. I see no other speakers, so Madam Clerk, if you call the roll.
Councilmember Lutke?
Yes.
Councilmember Lutke votes yes. Councilmember Mink?
Yes.
Councilmember Mink votes yes. Councilmember Sales?
Yes.
Councilmember Sales votes yes. Councilmember Albornoz?
Yes.
Councilmember Albornoz votes yes. Councilmember Dewando?
Yes.
Councilmember Dewando votes yes. Councilmember Katz?
Yes.
Councilmember Katz votes yes. Councilmember Stewart?
Yes.
Councilmember Stewart votes yes. Councilmember Fani Gonzalez?
Yes.
Councilmember Fani Gonzalez votes yes. Councilmember Balcom?
Yes.
Councilmember Balcom votes yes. Councilmember Friedson?
Yes.
Councilmember Friedson votes yes. Councilmember Glass?
Yes,
Councilmember Glass votes yes.
and that is unanimous. Thank you very much, colleagues. And thank you very much, Ms. Sacconi. We are now going to move to our second bill for final reading this morning. That is Bill 1523, Landlord-Tenant Relations, Anti-Rent Gouging Protections. And if Ms. McCartney Green. So I want to start this morning's conversation by acknowledging that every member of this council recognizes that renters need some level of help and protection. The various pieces of legislation that have been introduced over the last number of months and the public comments of every single council member has shown that something needs to be done. There is a very strong acknowledgement from this body that people are struggling to pay their rent and that there are some bad actors who are price gouging and rent gouging. I personally have heard from residents who have had their rents increased by double digits, in some cases 30, 35%. I've seen the letters. I know it's true. This council, through our actions, legislation, and statements, are all committed to making sure that double-digit rent increases do not happen. I believe it is very safe to say that we're unified in saying double-digit rent increases are wrong. And Montgomery County, much like other jurisdictions, also is facing a housing crisis. We want to make sure that housing here is affordable and attainable for anyone who wants it at all income levels. And according to the Council of Governments, Montgomery County needs to produce over 31,000 low-cost housing units by 2030 in order to keep up with our growing demand. And as I've said from the very beginning of this conversation, as I've said ever since I got elected to the county council, if we want to have more housing that is affordable, we need to build more housing. That has been my guiding principle throughout this entire conversation. And I've spoken to residents who've received the double-digit rent increases and about the instability that they are facing. And we know that more needs to be done to help them. And so the conversation and the legislation that is before us today is a balancing act, quite frankly. Trying to balance the needs of residents today to stay in the homes and also to not discourage future homes from being built for future residents who want them. It's important to note that Montgomery County, 1/3 of our residents are foreign born. We do not build walls around Montgomery County. We want to continue building houses to be a beacon from around the world so people can continue moving here. And so as we enter this conversation today, as we begin this debate on this bill, I want to extend my appreciation to all of my colleagues for their earnest efforts to get us here. I know there's a lot of disagreement on the dais. There is a lot of disagreement from all those who are following this conversation. But there is universal agreement that we need to make housing more affordable. That is the underlying message for today. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to the chair of the Planning, Housing, Parks Committee, Vice President Friedson, for a readout.
Thank you, Mr. President. Appreciate your comments, and thank you for everybody for your work and interest on this issue. First, let me recap the Planning, Housing, Parks Committee sessions. We first had a committee panel discussion, an in-depth conversation with a wide breadth of stakeholders that was data-driven in January. The committee then held two sessions on both bills, Bills 1523 and 1623, the initial being on June the 15th, where we dove into both bills in a very comprehensive way. We had a number of other council members who joined us as well as part of those discussions, and then a second on June 26th to take up motions made by committee members. On the 26th, multiple amendments were adopted to Bill 1523, including changing the rent increase allowance from 8% plus CPI as introduced to 3% plus CPI-U with a 6% overall cap, adding language to allow for fair return increases applications via Method 2 regulations, eliminating the exemption for single-family homes and condominiums, adjusting the capital improvements surcharge section to include and account for federal, state, and local mandates, county attorney technical amendments, as well as adding a transition clause to handle existing notices that have yet to take effect at the time of the bill's passage and effective date. I'll just turn it over to Miss McCartney Green to add anything that I haven't, and then I'm happy to close us out and yield it back to you, Mr. President.
Good morning, Council. I think you surmised that very well, Council Vice President Friesen, so that ends the report out.
Great. So thank you for that. Thank you to all the work that you put in. We had 2 staff members that each worked on the separate bills that were part of our conversations. I want to thank Ms. Wellens as well, who really was the primary staff lead on Bill 1523. Ms. McCartney Green was the primary staff lead on Bill 1623. Thank both of you for the considerable amount of work that you put into it. Also want to acknowledge DHCA that was at all of our sessions and provided significant feedback, and we very much appreciate that, as well as OLO, who is here today for colleagues to answer any questions, and we took up their report that was requested by the previous council, the previous Fed committee. With that, I just want to note, I was an initial co-sponsor of 1523. A few months ago, 6 council members came together and compromised to get to our initial launching point. When we developed 1523, we looked at national models for areas that struck a balance between renter protections and inability for the housing market to grow and to continue to build. The original bill was based off of that. As discussed, the bill as amended in committee takes a different approach. It really adopts many of the provisions much closer to Bill 1623. And I am concerned that it threatens the balance that we were initially trying to achieve in the initial approach that we were attempting to take. So I removed my name, and 3 other council members have removed their name from this bill, given the fact that it does take a different approach, based on the fact that I am concerned that the approach could exacerbate the very problems that we're trying to solve. We are in a housing crisis. We don't have enough supply compared to demand, and as a result, housing units are unaffordable to far too many people, and the power dynamic is with landlords who control limited supply of what residents and families need. I believe that the primary way to solve this issue of the long term is to build more housing at all levels of affordability, and I do think that our decisions today will have a significant impact on the county for decades to come. This council and the previous council, I believe, over the last 5 years has done more to address housing than any other 5-year period in the county's history. I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud to work with each and every one of you on those issues. But I am concerned that however well-intentioned we may be, our decisions today could risk that progress. I just will close and say that personally, I have evolved quite a bit on this issue. Hearing from residents about some shocking and excessive rent increases. I do believe those come from a relatively small number of very bad actors, as the data indicates. And I had indicated to colleagues that I was willing to go to 6% plus CPI with a 9% cap to avoid the double-digit increases. I think the council president was noting that this is an evolution for me personally on the county's involvement in housing that we desperately need more of, but I do believe that it's important that we look at targeted challenges with scalpel as opposed to hammer approaches, and that is the way in which I have approached this issue and the reason why I have ultimately removed my name from the bill, because it does take a significantly different approach than the one that was introduced, and why I respectfully voted no at committee. But it was a 2-to-1 committee vote. That committee recommendation is before the body, and with that, Mr. President, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Vice President Friesen. Thank you, Ms. McCartney Green, and colleagues. Just so everybody is aware, in our packet, I had asked for everybody to submit their amendment so we could have a thoughtful, data-driven, deliberative conversation. And so in the staff packet are the amendments in the order in which we're going to discuss them. And so at this point in time, before we start working through all of those various amendments, I welcome any opening comments colleagues might have. Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. I am very excited. I'm just going to put it out there. I am very happy. I am proud that this council came together to this day to have a permanent solution to protect tenants in Montgomery County. And I think we have the responsibility to walk the talk. We love to say that Montgomery County is so progressive. This is walking the talk. Am I unhappy with every single amendment that has been presented? No. I'm unhappy even with this version of the PHP committee, which I am a proud member of? No. But you know what? I am here as an elected official. I am here to pass something that will move us forward and evolve this county that I call home. I'm the only immigrant here, and I'm telling you, I am so proud to live in this country where I can make changes that will benefit my family, my neighbors, my kids' friends, and so on. That is our responsibility. So we are gonna have pretty strong disagreement on some of these amendments, but that's okay. That's the beauty of democracy. I will be so bored if I have people that agree with me all the time. My husband doesn't even do that. I will divorce him. And I, I'm a member of PHP. I don't think anybody here has the experience that I have on development. No one. I come from the Planning Commission. No one. And I'm gonna tell you one thing. There is no such thing as the development community says this. It's not true. They all have different views. I've had developers coming to me and saying, Natalie, 3 with a cap at 6, we don't like it, but we can live with it. Okay? It's true. So there's no such thing as developers are the devil and they all are rich white people. Well, there's a variety. and the same thing with the hard left. I'm a progressive. I'm more lefty than people realized. But I also know that it takes 2 to tango, and that is not my way in the highway. I will never pass legislation or move forward on something just to get the headline. That is not me. That will never be me. I compromise. That's my duty. Otherwise, I am here just warming up a seat and saying yes to everybody without passing anything. Okay, so I am a member of the PHP committee, but I'm also the chair of the Economic Development Committee for this county council. And that means taking care of the workforce. It's not just about having people live in this county, it's about, or working in this county, it's about making sure they can live and afford living in this county. That's a workforce issue. I cannot just see the development side, I have to see the workforce side. That's my duty. And with that, I won't say anything else because I see the look. And I am so ready to move on these amendments. I will not comment on some of them because it's just not worth it. I'm just going to say no. And yes on some of them. So that's it. Back to you, Mr. President.
That was the look of listening, active listening. Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez. We were the 2 that were tangoing on PHP to put this bill forward. I appreciate also Councilmember Friesen's leadership of the committee. He said we would have a fair, open, honest discussion of the bills, and we did. We put them forward in the democratic process, and here we are. I want to thank Miss McCartney Green and Miss Wellens in her absence for their work on the HOME Act and on the anti-rent gouging bill. This is the definition of a compromise. We had 2 very different bills with different rates and different provisions. The HOME Act was a 3% cap or inflation, whichever was lower. The anti-rent gouging bill was a 8% plus inflation, and we ended up in the middle. And it is the definition of a compromise. We heard testimony from some people actually who were in this room today months ago about how 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% increases were forcing them to make decisions to self-evict and to move. And I just want to remind people that our DHCA for years has considered a 10% increase to be constructive eviction. If you pay $2,000 a month, and good luck finding that in Montgomery County right now, 10% is $200 extra. It's a whole another mortgage payment in that year. Most Americans cannot find $300 in an emergency. 40%, nearly 40% of our county rents. That's over 400,000 of our residents. Disproportionately, Black, Latino, and immigrant. Almost 60% of Black residents rent. I was one of those kids for the first 20 some odd years of my life who had to move from substandard housing to try to find rents that allowed my mom to be able to support our family. This is not a theoretical exercise. If we want to maintain 4 of the top 10 most diverse cities in the country, we have to protect tenants. They deserve the same stability that everyone else who has a 30-year mortgage gets, to know what their rent, what their mortgage is going to go up every year. I'm really proud of this bill. It's not perfect. I think it's absolutely true that this will not impact the market. 50 years ago, this council passed emergency rent regulation, decided to sunset the law. We passed voluntary rent guidelines. We passed 2 forms of stabilization that I authored during the pandemic. The sky did not fall. Housing is being built. This is a great place to live. It will continue to be built, regardless of the actions taken here today. The question is, will we protect our diverse community and folks who are most vulnerable? In the PHP committee yesterday, we had a very important discussion. This has been a very, not ironic, but I think appropriate last week. We had a 2-day racial equity retreat, and we talked about the policies of exclusionary zoning and intentional policy and law decisions that kept people of color and low-income people out of housing. We had a presentation yesterday about redlining here in Montgomery County and how that impacted our community. Rental practices and fees are part of that larger story. The vast majority of landlords do the right thing. That's another reason why this will not impact the market. Over the last 10 years, the average rent increase was around 2%, well below what this bill caps at. So I just think we need to remember that today. I won't be supporting many of these amendments because I think the bill that came out was a compromise, but we'll have a robust discussion and we will make progress on behalf of our nearly 400,000 residents who need it right now. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Councilmember Albornoz.
All right, happy Peace Day. I want to begin by thanking you, Council President, for acknowledging the loss of Mark Hansen. Mark was a dear friend who really took me under his wing my first term working for the administration of Ike Leggett, and was an incredible guidepost for me. I'm so proud that Christine has continued his legacy of public service on behalf of all of the residents here of Montgomery County, and Mark represented the best of the best in public service, and he will be deeply, deeply missed. So I do also want to thank the PHP committee for their thoughtful deliberation. I want to thank the many advocates who have contacted our offices and who have passionately advocated on all sides of this critically important issue. And I also think the Council President said well, that what we are trying to do today is to strike a reasonable balance to protect tenants, protect our most vulnerable populations so that they can continue to benefit from the many housing options here in Montgomery County, while also striking a balance and acknowledging, as we all have, that we have very aggressive building goals for additional housing here in Montgomery County. But I want to provide the context from which I have looked at this issue and the lens that I have looked at this issue as we go through the various amendments, several of which I have proposed this morning. And I want to acknowledge something interesting. So the state of California from 2018 to 2022 spent $17.5 billion to address homelessness in the state. The state of California needs 2.5 million units to be able to address the housing needs of the state as a whole. And the senior advisor to Governor Newsom on housing matters, and Governor Newsom has made addressing homelessness his #1 policy priority issue, said, and I quote, "This is a problem that is decades in the making because of policy choices that we have made. At the end of the day, if we want to truly solve homelessness in America, we need more housing." California has some of the most aggressive rent stabilization and control policies in the country. San Francisco, San Jose, Los Angeles, have all established rent control for decades. And yet, despite all of that, California's homeless population is growing at a rate higher than any other state in the country. And so the issue is complex, but at the heart of it, as the advisor to Governor Newsom said, we need more housing. In Montgomery County, the Council of Governments has projected a housing target for Montgomery County to meet the needs of our future residents at 31,000 units by 2030. 31,000 units by 2030. That's 31,000 units not just to meet with the population surges that we anticipate, but it's also to help make sure that we have a diverse economy, that we have housing options at all levels, so that while we are trying to help and support the retired county resident who's on a fixed income stay in their home, we're also trying to help the freshman who's in college right now, who's crushing it at the University of Maryland and wants to work in Montgomery County in the biomedical sciences field, but needs a place to be able to live. We have to strike a balance between both issues. And I'm deeply concerned that what has come out of committee is not as balanced as it needs to be. We have already seen evidence, just in the last few weeks, unfortunately, that there are development projects that are critical to our future economic opportunity and development here in Montgomery County that have been pulled. And it's not because, it's because we are in a highly competitive market. We are competing not just with Northern Virginia, but we are competing with states around the country for additional development. And so I think we'd be naive to think that this isn't going to have a substantial impact on the possibility of future growth in the county, which will have a cascading negative effect for generations. We are playing with fire this morning. And so we have to be very cautious and deliberative as we go through this process. In the same retreat that Councilmember Jawando talked about last week, I shared with colleagues, and I mean this sincerely from the bottom of my heart, the deep respect I have for each of you. I know in my soul that each of us have the same goal, the same intention, to support our most vulnerable residents and leave this county a little bit better than we found it. That's our charge, that's our responsibility. And these decisions are tough, they're complicated, they're hard, they're emotional. But we gotta be really careful. Because if we're not, we are gonna set ourselves back in a way that will be difficult for us to be able to overcome. And so I look forward to the robust discussion, and I'll also just end with this note. I have received those same letters, I've had those same conversations. It is real that there has been rent gouging, especially in the last 2 years. A lot of it can be attributed to the fact that, and I voted both times for our former body to provide the longest regional rent stabilization at the time during COVID, dissuading our landlords from being able to increase their rents during that time. As inflation was increasing, as challenges with properties were increasing, as finding employees to be able to fill positions was increasing. So it's not a huge surprise that there was a significant increase. But the unscrupulous landlords who are off the grid are probably, regardless of what we do today, still going to take advantage of our most vulnerable residents, despite whatever tools we try to establish. And so the evidence of a systemic problem has not been very clear. But we're about to pass sweeping legislation to address an issue that has not been presented as a systemic issue. And we're doing it across the board, whether we've got luxury apartments or not. And so I am just as progressive as everybody here, but what we're about to do later this morning, whether people can afford to do this or not, is going to be a challenge. So I just wanted to share those thoughts, provide that context as we go through this discussion, and I yield back to you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Councilmember Katz.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Of all the legislation I've been involved in over the years, it's been a few, It's certainly, this one is certainly one of the most significant pieces of legislation that I've been involved in. And has been no secret, I personally have wrestled with it. This is a complex problem. No simple solution is going to solve this topic. And sometimes for complex problems, you need a series of simple solutions to get you there. And I think in some cases, this is where we are. We all have listened and learned and heard from people who agree and disagree. We've heard from residents of all ages, seniors on fixed income, people who struggle to make ends meet, people who believe that we should just listen to them and be concerned, but not as concerned about what others have to say, only what they have to say. And we've heard from property owners who have said that if we do this, they will not build, that it's easier to build someplace else. They will decide that they're not going to be back in Montgomery County to build. Make no mistake, and I mean this sincerely, every one of my colleagues is sincere, and we're walking on a tightrope. We want to be fair, and we've heard from those who think we are being fair, and from those who say we are not. I too was an original co-sponsor of 1523 and remain so. I too have evolved on this issue and have learned and literally struggled on what are the best solutions. I think we need to pass this legislation. I think we need to have some amendments, and I think some are sensible, and perhaps would be better if they were tweaked a little bit, and we'll have those discussions. But I think we need to have the discussion in this forum, in an open forum, to actually have what is best. I think this could affect the market. I agree with that. But I also think some of that will be short term and some are going to be longer term. We need to make certain people who rent have protections, and we need to make certain that a landlord realizes that their return on investment is a good investment while we walk that tightrope. We have a county council that is not going to agree on every topic of this amendment. That's my prediction. But I know that good, honorable people can look at the same topic and disagree, and they can do it in an agreeable way. But I also believe that we are doing what is best for this topic. You know, I go back to dealing with the development community. That has nothing to do with residential, so it's an easy illustration to make. But years ago, in Gaithersburg, when Rio was being developed, the city of Gaithersburg said that we didn't want a sea of parking in a big box store or a larger store. We wanted it to be walkable. We wanted it to be somebody could park their car and walk from one place to another. And the people who owned Rio at that time were not happy that we decided to do that. They were, in fact, not happy. You could underline the word "not" a lot of times. But what we did do is we said, we want you here. We want your development here. We want to work with you. But sit down with us and come up with better solutions. And the outcome of that, candidly, was that the Target store realized that they could get a escalator for a shopping cart. And that was the first two-story Target that was ever built in America. It was built at Rio. And it started out in an adversarial way. I don't want the adversarial way, but I do believe if we can sit down as a community, and they've always heard me say a community is a family, if we can sit down as a family and come up, not to be adversarial, but come up with a way, once this legislation is passed and we tweak some of the amendments, that we can come away with something that all sides might not applaud, but all sides understand how we got there and will continue to work with us. That's my goal, and I thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilmember Katz. Councilmember Mink.
Thank you to my colleagues for all of those thoughtful comments and for all the work that has gone into the bill and the deliberations that have brought us to this point. I wanted to actually first say something, if I may, point of privilege. A number of us were at a graduation of an incoming class of firefighters recently, and in the introductory remarks, they said something really lovely that I hadn't heard before, which was there were, of course, a bunch of kids there and babies who were making some noise. And they said, listen, don't worry about it. Don't be stressed out about it. We're glad you're here. You're part of this. You're part of our community. Be the babies that you are, be the toddlers that you are, be the parents that you are. It's okay. And I think it helped all of us to feel a little more relaxed. And so I would like to, if I may, point of privilege, to say also we understand and we're glad you're here to the little ones and the parents. And then I want to get to the discussions, but I'll just briefly note that we have when we were at that racial equity, social justice training together, one of the things that we talked about was, how do you approach thinking about these issues? Do you kind of start on the heart side of things or on the intellectual side of things? And we had some really good conversations that helped us get to know each other better. And one of the things that strikes me about, and absolutely I believe that we're all coming from a good place here, absolutely. One of the things that strikes me about making this issue so difficult is that there's very strong emotional pulls on both sides of this issue. There is deep-seated fear about disrupting our economy, disrupting our development. All of that. That's a real tangible fear and concern. We do not want to screw those things up. And we don't want to disappoint the partners who have helped us in all the development that we've been doing so far and who continue to work with us in that. And we also, obviously, there's a very strong emotional pull from folks who are in this room with us right now and who are representing many more who are just trying to stay housed and trying to help their neighbors stay housed, and who are representing many thousands of tenants across our county who want to be able to not only stay in their homes, but to not be cost burdened, not to be rent burdened, to be able to pay for the things that their kids need, to be able to pay their other bills, pay for summer camp, all of those types of things, which benefit all of us as well. So there are just a lot of strong emotional pulls coming from both sides, and I think we've all recognized that we can't just make an emotional decision here. If we did, we would end up at one side of the spectrum or another. So while it's important to keep those perspectives in mind, ultimately we need to be making research-based, data-based decisions, doing the very best we can to keep people housed while ensuring that we are continuing development. And I think that what came out of the PHP committee was a reasonable compromise. I would have felt comfortable with the research having us a little bit lower on some things. Other people would have had us been more comfortable with us a little higher. But I think we're at a place that is a reasonable compromise. There's a couple of things that we need to get through today, but I appreciate being able to go through them, discuss the facts, discuss the research in this open forum, and hopefully get this done and in a good place. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Sales.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to start by thanking my colleagues who sponsored both rent stabilization bills and the Planning House Parks Committee for their thorough work on these two bills. I'd also like to thank our council staff and the Office of Legislative Oversight for conducting a deep analysis of the effects of rent stabilization in our county. Moreover, I want to thank the county for actively engaging on this issue. Over the last year, we have heard passionate testimony from hundreds of residents, landlords, labor organizations, and trade associations through phone calls, emails, and letters on personal and virtual platforms. Your presence here today reminds me just how important housing is in our increasingly urban community. From retaining our current affordable housing supply to increasing our overall inventory of quality, affordable housing. I'm glad the Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee had 2 work sessions on these bills. At the second work session, I submitted a memo detailing my current position to my colleagues based on conversations with various stakeholders and reviewing correspondence from constituents and other interested parties. I have found that the double-digit increases my colleagues have already mentioned, proposed under the anti-rent gouging bill, are far too high to warrant its long-term consideration. I am also concerned that the 3% cap in the Home Act could have unintended consequences that cool the housing market. To that end, I would like to re-emphasize my support for a cap of around 5 or 6%. It would be unreasonable to increase the cap beyond that, mainly due to our affordable housing supply shortage and the growing number of rent-burdened residents. While this number is not ideal, I believe it is an excellent middle ground that balances the needs of developers with renters. Lastly, while the Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee deliberated these 2 pieces of legislation over the committee work sessions, we have looked at this issue from many perspectives. Change is not easy, and change does not always feel good either. I recall standing in this audience over a decade ago when we passed a $15 minimum wage, and most opponents said businesses would leave our county in droves. Yet I'm joining my colleagues at ribbon cuttings every day in this county. I am proud that our residents, especially our youth, are being offered job opportunities that pay over $15 an hour to avoid the dangers of ill-advised decisions. These are policies that place our values at the forefront and help everyone on their path to self-sufficiency. In my position of being a lawmaker and practicing oversight, I am reminded of the compassionate policy decisions that brought me to this county. As a former affordable housing resident, safe, quality, transit-oriented development housing allowed me to access resources and job opportunities to ensure a pathway out of poverty and to make it my priority to introduce my first ZTA 2302, which is on the agenda this afternoon, so you're more than welcome to stay, which will accelerate the development of economically and amenity-rich neighborhoods that provide a reasonable amount of affordable housing. I look forward to our respectful and extensive dialogue throughout today's discussion of each amendment, while prioritizing parameters and guardrails to establish a framework for keeping our residents housed and our working families on pathways to home ownership, and periodically reviewing the rental housing market to assess conditions and review and adjust policies to meet the needs of our renters and our landlords. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield.
Thank you. Councilmember Balcom.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank my colleagues for their statements this morning. I'm going to have more to say when we finish our discussion. We've got a lot of work to do. We've got a lot of decisions to make, and so we're ready to go. Thanks.
Ready to go. Councilmember Stewart.
Yes, I just want to echo Councilmember Balcom and just say thank you to my colleagues. Thank you to the county staff for all their work on this and all the residents who have come out. I just wanted to say, as the council member representing District 4, which has the most renters in the county, the outcome of the work that we have been doing over these last few months and that all of you have been doing for a long time really does impact the residents I represent. And just to underscore, as people have said before, this is not the only policy we need to work on to solve our affordable housing crisis, but this is so very important. And the reason it is so very important is because it will provide stability and predictability for people who rent in our community. And stability is so important as we think about our communities and given all that is going on in our country, in our world right now. And to be able to lessen the anxiety about what rent increases may be, and as Council President said so well, for those bad actors out there who are raising rents double digits, to make sure that our residents aren't facing that and aren't even facing the prospect of that is very important. And so stability is really important as we're looking at this policy. And I look forward to discussing the amendments. I want to thank particularly the staff of OLO for their excellent report and research that they did on this topic. I think it was very helpful to inform where we've gotten today, and will inform our discussion this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. There are 14 amendments that have been submitted that are in our packet, and we are going to start working through them right now with Ms. McCartney Green and colleagues. We do have DHCA here, we do have OLO here, and so at any point in time we want to bring them into the conversation. They are here to participate. And so let's go through the first amendment, which is a technical amendment. Ms. McCartney Green.
Thank you, Council President. And as mentioned, there are 15 amendments with DHCA's amendment, and we'll talk about that ahead of the council member sponsored amendments. So number one was the transition clause. During our PHP committee work session on June 26th, there was discussion of having the bill effective, but also have regulations that would complement the bill. The question was whether or not what would be effective first and what would happen. As a result of that conversation, council staff is recommending an amendment for a transition clause that would read that the requirements of this act must not apply and must not be enforced until the Method 2 regulations required on the act take effect. We think that this will be helpful to basically put a pause on implementation of the bill until those Method 2 regulations are approved by this council.
Thank you. Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you. Yes, we did discuss this in PHP. I just would like to clarify, and I'm probably going to ask Director Bruton. I think you just come on up now for this one, and just get a tent. Obviously, we said that we wanted the Method 2 regulations and that you would get those to us in a timely fashion. So I want you to talk about that. But I think we could parse out here that only the things that required Method 2 regulations would need to have this delay. And, for example, the cap itself. So I just want to understand from staff, does this apply, for example, to the cap itself?
And so previously, also at that same work session, we talked about a rent increase notice transition, and that's on page 8. And so with that notice provision, the cap would still be in effect at the passage of this bill or the regulations. Okay. And so regardless if a landlord, attempted to increase the rent between the council adopting it today and the regulations, that transition clause makes sure that the cap stays into effect as of now.
Okay.
Is that clear?
That is clear.
And I think Councilmember Mink was the one that inspired that amendment at the last.
Okay, so I don't need to amend this. That is already within what we're going to do later. Okay, that's what I just wanted to make sure.
There is an effective date amendment that will come later.
Yeah,
right.
Thank
this
you.
is technical in nature. Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez.
We're just gonna say that I discussed this with staff and I'm in complete agreement as it's written. So.
Thank you, Councilmember Albornoz.
So just a couple questions for Mr. Bruton. So I know this is tied to the addition of 8 additional staff members who will then be responsible for oversight of the of whatever it is we pass today. It takes a long time to hire people in Montgomery County. It takes a long time to recruit. It takes a long time to hire. We're talking months, if not years, in some instances. So what will be the plan during the transition as the regulations come over, and we'll deliberate those? But capacity is a concern within DHCA right now, for you all to be able to administer the policies that are already on the books, and you've testified and previous directors have testified regarding those challenges. So what would the plan be until we have those 8 individuals on board?
Thank you. That is an excellent question. Really appreciate it. I've already been in discussions with the county executive's office. There's really 3 parts, I think, to what we've been trying to build up in anticipation if you all pass this law today. The first is the staffing issue. I've already been in touch with the county executive staff about putting together a supplemental request for the funding that would be necessary, and already talked about the HR requirements to try to expedite the hiring of these. I think while we will need 8-ish staff to fully implement, we can prioritize the most essential staff in the hiring process and then move forward. And I'll come back to the staffing. The second part is making sure the regulations are done in a timely fashion. And I talked with the Office of the County Attorney and Cliff Royalty, who's one of their senior folks dealing with legislation and regulation. He's committed to give me significant time in collaboration to produce the regulations in a timely fashion to meet the timelines that are contemplated in the legislation as amended. And then the third part, which we will ultimately want to have a computerized database system in order to facilitate the recording of rents and the tracking of things. And I've discussed that with TEBS, and TEBS has indicated that they are, because of the nature of the legislation and the importance, able to do that for us at no charge. So reducing the cost burden for us, and we've already been in discussions about how we can facilitate the completion of the necessary database and portal to make this as easy as possible for staff as well as the landlords of the county.
That's helpful. I'd just encourage you in that transition, because I've been in county government a long time. I know how these things go. Maybe in the supplemental you can also include, if you feel it's necessary, to bring in some outside help in the short term to help facilitate and make sure the process flows so that we don't hold up any potential renovation projects that will benefit the residents of the properties that want to be able to make that transition. And I would also strongly encourage you and request that you engage all stakeholders as you develop those regulations to make sure this is a win-win and a two-way street. We want to encourage investment in properties and that we have a streamlined process that's clear, that's easy to follow, that's not ambiguous, because that is a problem in many other categories and areas. And we want to make sure we don't compound some of the barriers that may already exist.
So I'll just thank you for that recommendation. I fully commit to doing that. In the work I've done for the past decade, I represented both affordable homeless prevention, affordable housing advocates, as well as affordable housing developers. And part of what I was tasked with doing for that decade was to bring people together to try to build consensus around things. And so, as I've mentioned in discussing with a variety of council members who've asked me questions over the past weeks, I am very committed to bringing in stakeholders to get their points of view and input to try to minimize the unintended consequences and to try to make this process as easy and seamless as we can in implementing the law.
And just a process question for colleagues or Ms. McCartney Green, will this come back before the PHP committee, the Method 2 regulations, or will it come back before the full body?
It would come back before the full body, the council.
Okay,
full body.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Lutke.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just have like a process question. And I know there's a subsequent amendment later that my colleague has put forward. And so if that goes, then the bill would be effective 91 days post passage. If it's as is and it's currently written, it would be 6 months post passage. But there was something inherent in Councilmember Jawando's question that made me want to get clarification. So parts of the bill can't go into effect on one day and other parts on another, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so I know we'll take up the other piece of it later, but for this purpose right now, it would by accepting this amendment on the transition period, it would, if in fact expedited 91 days is our subsequent decision, the regulations, I know you're committed to trying to make them ready as soon as possible. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And I think you all saw in the material that I had submitted before, we're well on our way already to having draft, but those will be altered and changed through stakeholder input.
Okay, so I just wanted to make it clear that whatever our ultimate decision is later about the effective date, approving this transition clause, the goal is that none of it goes into effect until the regulations are ready and take effect, because they have to go together hand in hand, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
And
Thank you,
I'm
Mr. President.
I'm prepared to go through the timeline of what the effective date will be, but I want to be respectful and do that
Yeah,
towards the end.
absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice President Friedson.
Yeah, I was going to ask a similar question. The original amendment was if a landlord notifies a tenant prior to the effective date of this act or to the effective date of Method 2 regulations, so one or the other, regulations adopted under this act of a rent increase that would occur after the effective date of the act or of the regulation. So it uses or. And so what you're essentially proposing is to make that and. It would have to, they would not go into effect until both the effective date and the Method 2 regulations are adopted by the council.
Yeah, and I want to make sure we're clear so we're on the same page. And so what's on the packet in page 6 is talking about the transition clause of just the regulation. Council Vice President Friedson is raising a good point of what's already been adopted by the prior PHP committee, and that's on page 8, and that's talking about the notices in the transition. And so I would agree with Council Vice President Friedson that that would be an and if we go ahead and accept the transition clause that is on page 6.
Yeah, because the important point is a landlord doesn't change the rent under law. They're not legally allowed to change the rent the next day. There's a notice requirement. And so there's two transitions that the body needs to take up. One is the effective date of when when a notice can be issued, and the other is when a notice would take effect. And so I just want to make sure that everybody understands that there are really two transitions that need to be approved in a final bill.
That's correct. Any clarifications?
Okay, colleagues, this was a staff amendment. Is there a motion to adopt?
So move. Second.
Moved by Councilmember Fani Gonzalez, seconded by Councilmember Sales. All of those in favor of this amendment? And that's unanimous.
Good start. Peace Day.
Live it up, live it up. Let's keep it up.
On to amendment number 2. I'll turn it over to Councilmember Albornoz.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Council,
So obviously there was
I'm want to make sure we address the other technical amendment that's out from DHCA, and then we can,
Sure.
if that's okay with you.
Sure.
And so looking at Circle page 203, the council received an amendment, a request from DHCA that would amend 1523, essentially deleting section 2961, and that's the annual reporting requirement. Already in the county code, there is an annual reporting that's required by landlords each year. My understanding is that DHCA has taken a look at it and realized that the same requirements that's being required here in 1523 can be met in our existing law. I'm going to let Scott.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, we don't want to burden landlords or DHC staff any more than we need to. We have, as you all are familiar, the annual reporting requirements in the annual rent survey. It's very similar to the reporting requirements here. And so we believe they would be redundant and burdensome and unnecessary. That said, the OLO report, as everybody's been saying today, very good OLO report, made several good recommendations about how we could improve upon our data gathering with the annual rent survey. And so we're committed to coming back to you with some amendments for section 2951, which is the annual rent survey, in order to make those recommended changes and improve things, and we can put any little tweaks we need to better facilitate data collection for the Rent Stabilization Act into those amendments.
I see colleagues have comments on this, and I appreciate the amendment, Director Bruton. From my perspective, it is extremely important for this legislation to state that there is going to be future data to review on all sides. And I understand the department's concern about duplication of efforts and about staff capacity. I personally would feel more comfortable if the this legislation explicitly referred to a collection of data. Not wanting to be duplicative on your end, if it can be additive or just for the sake of explicitly stating that there is data to review for future consideration. So I don't know if that, if there's an amendment to your proposal, or if as written in the law, in the bill, there is no other work for DHCA to actually do.
Sure, we would welcome that. We agree that it would be very valuable to track data for everyone's concerns about how, what are the impacts over time of the legislation. And so we absolutely agree. If you all would like, if the council staff would like to make an amendment to that just specifies that the data would be made, we're fine with that.
Ms. McCartney Green.
Agreed, and that's something that can be done here as making an amendment that, as required under Section 2951, any annual reporting requirements would also be subject to the requirements that are here in Bill 1523. I can definitely draft that up.
I would rather than removing the requirement, I would prefer to keep it in the legislation. Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez.
I have discussed this with Mr. Britton, and I move this amendment forward, as amended just by now.
Okay, so moved by Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez, seconded by Councilmember Jawando. We're moving around here. Councilmember Lutke.
Thank you. No, I was just going to say that as noting, no one wants duplicative stuff, and it's great to have everything all in one place. I'm all in favor of efficiencies, but I also love data, so I don't want to miss anything. But I note that, and this can be, as you noted in the, this will fix this, but we should delete this piece here, correct, per Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez's motion, except as amended that you just did. Yes?
This is a separate amendment from the transition that
Yes,
we're adding.
it's but the amendment that DHCA has proposed is actually a deletion. So,
Yes.
and we're good
Yes.
with that.
Yes.
And I note that you can include in the regulations as you develop them and clean up that this data is part and parcel of the same and to be included. It would be then very clearly spelled out in the regulatory scheme.
Yes, and
Okay.
we come back to you
Yeah.
all, and so you'll get a
Thank
second
you.
bite at the apple on that.
All right, thank you.
I think we're all good on this. So all those in favor of Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez's proposal, motion, and that is unanimous. Thank you, Mr. Bruton. Thank you, Ms. McCartney Green. Okay, back to regularly scheduled programming. The amendments that are in the packet. The second amendment, I'll turn it over to Councilmember Albornoz.
Okay, so I again appreciate the thoughtful deliberation and to go from the double digit in the one bill to the single digit in the other bill. I'll acknowledge there have been talking points in us wanting to have a regional approach as we address this issue, but at 6%, we will have the most aggressive rent cap, I believe, it will be higher than Tacoma Parks and the District of Columbia's. When discussing the other exemptions, will not necessarily be consistent with what the District of Columbia has pursued. So, Mr. Bruton, could you talk a little bit about what the 6%, how that would connect to other parts of the region that have rent stabilization bills?
Sure. So Prince George's County currently has a 1 year, and their cap is 3%. DC, their long-running cap has been 10%, but they passed legislation recently that for the next 2 years, they will be capped at 6% per year. And it remains to be seen if they will extend that. There was a significant amount of political pressure, and so that 6% cap may or may not be extended beyond the 2 years.
Thank you. But there's a sunset for both of those pieces of legislation.
For
Prince George's and the District of Columbia with what they recently passed.
Correct.
Thank you. So I'm concerned, as we've said before, about the significant tipping of the scales. I also didn't mention in my opening comments the potential for the opportunity cost here. We spent 2 years going through the Vision 2030 exercise, 2050 exercise to hear from community stakeholders, and for a year of those 2 years I was council president, and I got crushed from all sides on that issue. Advocates who didn't want there to be the growth that was ultimately proposed in the vision document, while others feeling it needed to be more aggressive than it should be. And my concern is that if we're not careful, what we passed will be not much more than words on a page. because we will need the development to go along with the recommendations made and set forth through Vision, which was opposed by the county executive, but that will be critical in ensuring that we meet that 30,000 plus housing requirement moving forward. We also have this unique opportunity of an interest in property owners in converting commercial space to residential. We've also seen some evidence of, because this ebbs and flows, a migration outside of the District of Columbia coming back to the suburbs, where we had seen the opposite trend for the last 15 years. So my concern is that, again, if we tip the scales too far in one direction, then we miss that opportunity to, over the next 10 years, be even more aggressive than we have been in partnering with our development community to meet the housing requirements that we all acknowledge that we need. And so for that reason, I believe 9% is more consistent with that and more reasonable, and I'd like to move that forward as a cap.
Councilmember Almendarez has moved 9% hard cap. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Councilmember Balcom. Comments? Okay. I will simply say that I understand the intention of the amendment, and that is to limit any increases below double digits. And that is something that I have long said that we should not do. It is unconscionable to have certain double-digit rent increases as we've experienced. And while I support that goal, a majority of this council is already on the record and has already voiced their support for the proposal that is in the bill, that is CPI plus 3% capped at 6%, and so I view this amendment as moot and I will not be supporting it. Not saying anything else. All those in favor of the proposal of the motion, raise your hand. All those opposed? And the motion fails. Next amendment, I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Mink.
Thank you. This amendment is for the regulation of fees. It's just to close a loophole that we have seen in other jurisdictions commonly, to learn from some of our neighbors and from some other folks across the country, where we have seen that when rent regulations, whatever they may be, go into play, that landlords then replacing rent with new and increased fees to basically shift the rent gouging into fee gouging. So this is to allow us to regulate that, to ensure that that doesn't happen. There are a variety of ways to do that. I have in here to basically cap the fee increases the same way that we're going to cap the rent increases. But if folks have other ideas on that, happy to listen to those ideas as well. Just want to make sure that we don't fall into the same trap that we have seen from our neighbors. And Mr. Bruton, if you would be able to speak to this amendment, that would be helpful. What would be the consequences of passing rent regulation without also regulating fees?
So I can't predict what individual landlords would do, but what this, as amended, the current bill does not regulate fees. And so a landlord could, say, theoretically charge you $2,000 for rent and $1,000 for fees. Just saying, I mean, that's kind of an extreme or hyperbolic example, but it's not regulated, and so there would not be a prohibition on that. And so whether it be this amendment as exactly worded or something else, or like a nub of something, DHCA does advise that it would be helpful to have in the law the ability for DHCA to regulate fees to make sure those types of workarounds don't happen. And then obviously you all would get to take a look at that through Method 2 regulations.
So with that, I'll make a motion to regulate the fees.
Motion moved by Councilmember Mink, seconded by Councilmember Jawando. Councilmember Balcom.
Thank you. I was confused by the flashing green. It's a new system. Thank you, Councilmember Mink, for this amendment. My concern is that some of the fees maybe utilities, maybe HOA is in addition to the lease, and a lot of these fees go up more than inflation and more than 6%. And we just had the discussion about this capacity, staffing capacity for the office. So I'm concerned about the exceptions. For instance, if it is, if the fee is legitimately it goes up more than what is regulated, it comes to you for approval, or the rate, then you would have to approve all these fees and whether you have the capacity of that. The other issue is the new fees that come up. I really understand the issue of bad actors coming along and trying to increase fees or make up fees that weren't there prior to rent control. But there are legitimate new fees that come up. I'm thinking of maybe EV access. We've had many discussions about how multifamily apartments, multifamily units are going to handle EV access, new gym access, extra parking fees. So things come up in the normal course of doing business all the time, and those new fees aren't a gouging or a way to get around rent control. There's just a normal, it's just the normal cost of doing business. And so how would you propose that your office is going to handle all these requests for new fees?
Thank you. Excellent question. Obviously, our motivation needs to be in enforcing a law or regulation would be to balance the needs of the landlord to pay for what they're offering, the needs of the tenant, but also our staffing needs, as you say. And a law doesn't work if we don't enforce it, or if we don't have the capacity to enforce it. Based on my experience in the district, they have something called a services and facilities petition, which they use to regulate fees in certain ways. And that deals more with, say, for example, utilities were included in your rent, but then the landlord goes from a single meter on the building to metering every single unit, and they want to transfer that cost to the tenant. Then you're effectively taking away something you were paid in your rent, and you would be charged separately through the utility company. And so they've dealt with it as, if something is taken away, you should receive a reduction in rent. If something is given, then the landlord should be able to petition to add something in rent. And I will also add, there are kind of two different types of fees. Those are fees that are voluntary. So say, for example, you added a charging station where you could use your credit card or something to pay for that, and that would be a voluntary thing. Or if you added a gym where you had a key fob access and you only had key fob access if you paid, that's different than, say, if you added a gym and you charged everyone an across-the-board amenity fee no matter what. And so I agree with you with the complexity. We would try to formulate regulations that would be minimally invasive, and to get at, we would want to make, basically we would want to give guidance to the landlord that you should be providing something of value in exchange for the fee, not just, say, an amenity fee for the general benefit of living in the unit, something like that. And so I tend to look at this one as, and we would have to come back to you with regulations to be minimally restrictive, but to make sure that there weren't the abuses like the hyperbolic example that I gave earlier.
So my view on this is, I think that this is a really complex issue, and I think that from the landlord perspective, this is one of those very detailed issues. I can't support this without seeing the regulation before that. So thank you.
Councilmember Sales.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Burton, I know that you're new to this position, but you know, during COVID, the county saw many landlords get creative and add additional fees to get around the temporary rent cap. And I was wondering if you can tell me anything about the volume of fee complaints that were received during the COVID rent control period. and how those complaints were handled by the department. I don't know if there's any record of how that was handled and how, I know you've shared how you hope to continue should this measure pass, but just wanted to see what our history has been in this space.
Sure. So, thank you. As you mentioned, I'm new. Would it be okay to ask Nicole Katravanos, the manager of our Office
Yes.
of Landlord and
Absolutely.
Tenant Affairs, to answer the question?
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
If you could just introduce yourself for the record.
Nicole Katravanos, Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs Managers, DHCA. Similar to Director Bruton, I have been at DHCA for just a little bit over a year, and I don't have exact data regarding the complaints that we've received with respect to fees and fee increases. However, within the past year, speaking with the previous manager and with the investigators, the majority of which have been within the department for at least over 5 years, there has been an increase in complaints with respect to fees. Whether the fees have been increased or there's new fees being incorporated to leases. But I can't give any specific numbers. We could go through the data and then provide concrete information afterwards.
Yeah, I think if this does pass and Mr. Burton does come back for the specific language and process, it would be helpful to have that information because, you know, we need to ensure, are we passing this to, to cap any increases at the same cap as the rent cap should it pass. So I look forward to those discussions should this move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you. Ms. McCartney Green, I just want to make sure I understand and everyone understands, the millions watching at home, what this would do. It would cap the increase at 3% or 6%. Just explain what those 3 and 6 are related to. Are they the base rent amount?
Yeah, let's take it
Similar
back
to-
there. And so right now in the bill, there's a base rent. And so the base rent includes the fixed monthly charge that a tenant would really charge every month. In addition to that, landlords can also charge other fees, whether it's utility, management, parking fees. What this is regulating is generally any fees above the base rent would be capped at the CPI plus 3%, or 6% of the original fee that was in that original lease agreement. And so if it's above that, the landlord has the opportunity at least to appeal to the director to get an approval of an increase above that cap.
Let's use real numbers so we understand. So if the CPI plus 3% is related to the fee, not the base rent.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, so if the fee was 100, now you're making me do math, right?
Yeah,
The fee
I know
was
it's dangerous. Let's use $100.
Let's do
The fee's
$100.
$100.
Keep it easy. Keep it easy.
Right, so if the fee was $100 and a CPI plus 3%, let's say that amounted to 4%, right? That would have you at a rate of $4, right? $4, right? Okay.
If it's a monthly thing.
If it's monthly.
Yeah.
Right, so you would only be able to increase that by $104. Is everyone on page? By $4, sorry, by $4.
Year to year.
Year to year.
Year to year. Right. Got it. So which would be 4 times 12, whatever that is, right?
Right.
48. So $50.
I can help you.
Roughly $50.
Roughly $50. Just
Correct.
want to give people context
Yes.
of what we're talking about. So $50 a year, or so I think I seconded this because I agree it's the right principle. What I don't know is what's the right number, and so I would be comfortable if we just gave you authority to regulate fees as a general matter, and didn't specify. I know this is not the amendment before us, but I'm just saying what I'm be comfortable. Didn't specify what the number was, and we could deal with that in regulation once you did some research, talked to people, looked at it. We know this is an issue. And last year in Florida, the governor there passed an unlimited fees bill that you can charge any fee, and so there is a effort to kind of get around this. So we certainly wouldn't want to leave a gaping loophole, and there should be regulation. There are reasons why fees need to go up. So I would that would maybe be a friendly amendment to say we just give DHCA authority through Method 2 to regulate fees, and you would come back to us with what that regime would look like.
I second.
Well, are you offering to make
I am
that
offering
amendment?
that, yeah.
And I would support that. Yeah, I mean, I think that in the principle is the important thing. We want to make sure there's the ability to regulate fees. We also want to do it in a way that is sensible. I completely agree with the points raised that we want to make sure that the appropriate flexibility is there. We just need to make sure that we're not unintentionally leaving the same loophole that Florida is right now creating. So I think that makes sense. If that, what are your thoughts, Mr. Bruton?
Oh, yes, I agree. So I had jotted down something, and then Ms. McCartney Green can add something to it. She made a good point. Something very simple, like the director must adopt Method 2 regulations necessary to regulate fees on regulated rental units. Sorry about the repetition, of course.
So moved.
Oh, wait, she wants to add
I would like to
something.
clarify that.
Go ahead, Ms.
I'd like to
McCartney.
clarify not only to regulate the fees, but to set what the rate or the cap is. And so you're doing both things, setting it and regulating what those fees will be.
And that was the intention?
Yes, through Method
And
2.
You still agree
Just
with
to
that?
clarify, setting the rate doesn't specify how low or high it would be. And also, I just wanted to add one thing I forgot to say to Councilmember Balcom's question. I want to assure you that I don't want to take on the responsibility of having landlords have to go through the department for every single new fee they do. I want to give guidance and regulation about what is within the parameters that works. And then if things are outside those parameters, then you have to apply. So yeah, I want to be as little burdensome as I can.
Okay, so that friendly amendment has been adopted or accepted. Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez.
My questions have been answered. Thank you.
Very good. Councilmember Alvarez.
Thanks. Can we go back to utilities? Are they included or are they not included in fees? Or does it depend on the nature of the...
It depends on the
lease?
landlord. Usually, I can't speak to every landlord, but usually utilities are either included in your rent because they are master metered and they just divide it up among all the units, or if your unit is individually metered, then you are being charged by the utility itself, and the landlord is not in the chain.
Okay. Because we just passed a month ago 7% increase in WSSC fees. So obviously higher than 6%. So how would that work? Would a landlord, would all of them have to seek approval? Or
so in those two different scenarios I mentioned, if it's a multi-metered building, then the landlord would not be bothered at all. The fee, like your per kilowatt hour fee for what you're using would be charged directly to your individual utility bill. If it was master metered and the landlord had to absorb that cost, then I would advise the landlord to file a fair return petition to say that my bottom line, my net operating income has been impacted by this increase in utility fees, and therefore I'm filing this, to make the adjustment.
And just a general, personnel question, coming from DC, I know their office is rather large, but approximately how many people are responsible for working through exemption requests that landlords may have in the District of Columbia's housing department? And then how many do we have in Montgomery County currently?
Since we don't have I'm sorry if I'm mistaking your question, we don't have the law yet in Montgomery County.
Understood, but just, there's a transition period here, and we're adding another layer, even if there are guidelines. If they fall outside of the guidelines, there is still a process by which property owners will need to come to you, and I'm trying to be able to understand capacity.
Let's see. So for DC, I'm taking this from the fiscal impact statement we provided to OMB. DC has 11 FTEs in the office that deals with rent stabilization, and they're broken up by one manager, 2 rental program specialists. Those are actually their lawyers, strange name for it. 2 program specialists, 1 housing provider ombudsman, and 6 contact representatives. And so the contact representatives, they deal with the intake, and then the way DC deals with administering certain petitions is that they have an outside accounting firm that will run the numbers. The contract specialists handle checking for accuracy and did you follow the rules and does it have all the required information, and then the outside accounting firm checks to make sure the numbers are correct. I can go into more detail, but I won't bother you with that. And we are recommending, let's see, we are recommending 4 so our recommendation for would be we have 1 manager, 1 senior IT specialist to deal with the obvious things, 1 investigator to get at issues of noncompliance, 1 program manager, 1 admin specialist, and 4 program specialists. And so the 4 program specialists, among their duties, would be to deal with the incoming applications, and then we would contemplate, depending on the volume, as to whether those 4 program specialists are adequate or if we need to bring on a contractor for specific math checking or things like that.
Okay, thank you. I think I appreciate the questions from colleagues at the beginning of this particular amendment, and there really isn't very much evidence necessarily to support the need for it, other than, again, anecdotal information and concerns that have been raised by some, but no real systemic information that would that gives me pause in terms of what are we actually trying to solve here. And I'm a little uncomfortable with the ambiguity too of what we might be able to pass. I get the intent, but I just don't think that's good policy. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to jump in and share 2 experiences that I've personally had over the last year in talking with tenants in 2 different parts of the county. One, during the pandemic, when we had our limits in place, when we froze any rents, was talking with some residents in East County who said that while their rent was not allowed to increase, their parking fees increased a lot. It happened. But more disturbing was earlier this year, in February, I was talking with residents in Gaithersburg on Clapper Road. And the residents, 2 well-educated people younger than me, had a 1-bedroom apartment. They weren't complaining about the rent. The rent was fine. What they complained about was for their 1-bedroom rental apartment, they were paying nearly $500 a month in electricity bills. That's more than my single-family home for electricity. They did not have servers. They did not have any fancy electrical equipment. It was sub-metered, and that was the deal that whomever owns that property engaged in with whomever operates that meter to charge them nearly $500 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment. It's unconscionable. I've already looked into it to see what we can do here, and the county does not have any authority over this. This is state law. And so there's a real problem here. And so I know that there are other circumstances, other avenues in which landlords are trying to increase fees, and it is real. I appreciate Councilmember Albernaz noting that we as a body, the council, unanimously supported a 7% increase in WSSC fees for water. And so we have to have some ownership over that as well. And I am comfortable with DHCA creating a fee schedule, as I understand it to be. That's a fee schedule? Yeah. That's what I would prefer. Some guidelines to see some guidelines for property owners to help recognizing that there are increases outside all of our controls that they need to manage. But there's got to be something done about a couple living in a one-bedroom paying $500 for a sub-metered electric bill. Unconscionable. I've already begun conversations with members of the state delegation to see what we can do in that regard, but it is proof positive that fees are being used, that utilities are being used in other ways, and we got to stop that as we can. But I am comfortable with this amendment to set up a fee schedule by DHCA. Vice President Friedson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just 2 points of clarification. I just want to make sure I understand the amended motion. There was 2 aspects of the initial motion. One was about setting the rate. The other one was about new fees and prohibiting new fees unless you get approval. Any new fee had to be approved by the department, which does seem to be an administrative question, and I think that is part of what I heard from Councilmember Balcom, among others, Councilmember Albornoz as well. So I just wanted to confirm that. Is the idea that this amendment would only deal with the rate setting and not the prohibition against new fees, or was it only changing the first part? So that's clarification number 1. Well, I'm going to ask the motion
Okay.
first because this body moves amendments, and then we can get clarification from the department after that.
My intent was just to amend A1, which was related to the fee schedule. So the B part remained in my view.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I would be fine with just sending the whole package to regs and just saying, I want to make sure that we give DHCA full flexibility to, to put together something that makes sense and to do the requisite research and what have you. And I just want to make sure that you have the ability to include in that both existing fees and new fees. Taking into account that, yes, I think that Mr. Bruton agrees that he doesn't want to have to be looking at every single new fee, and so writing those regs in a way that, as you were mentioning, would have, have a set of guidelines that would prevent you from having to look at every. Would you be able to speak to this? You see where I'm going with this?
Sure, yes. So DHCA would prefer, no offense to anyone, but would prefer that the amendment as discussed would replace the entire amendment, because it would be regulatorily burdensome on the department, but also on landlords to have to check with us for every single fee. I think providing guidelines on what are, like within the boundaries fees, like Council President Glass was indicating, and then having it more for if you're asking for something outside of what is normal, then you have to apply. Or if you're asking for something outside of whatever you all determine in collaboration with us are reasonable limits on the increase of fees.
Okay, so I'll go back to the motion makers just for the clarification.
I'm good with that.
Department.
Yeah, so just saying basically that DHCA will regulate fee increases and new fees, something that gives broad authority, and then we're going to expect, as we work on regs, to see something that is going to limit the necessary capacity on the DHCA side for.
Okay, and as the
processing.
director and council attorney are negotiating the language, as it was written, it's a little bit unclear to me because it talks about a landlord of a regulated unit cannot increase a fee charged to a tenant, but doesn't say the fee charged by the landlord to the tenant. And WSSC, I mean, if this speaks to the nuance of these issues and some of the concerns that I have, the master, dynamic, as you talked about, where there's one energy bill, one water bill, if it's a single meter for an entire building, particularly the older building stock, that's much more common as opposed to individualized meters. In an individualized meter, the landlord generally doesn't charge anything. They have the utility company directly charge, and so it would be unreasonable to insert the landlord into that dynamic. So could I just get a clarification on that? Because I think as it was originally written, it speaks to fees charged to a tenant. Well, the tenant could pay cable fees, they could pay water fees, they could pay energy fees, et cetera, gas fees.
Yeah, absolutely. That ambiguity is problematic. And with, I think, as understood now, we would be replacing the entire text of the Councilmember Mink's originally proposed amendment. And Mr. Cartney-Green will polish up the language, but effectively what we have is the director must adopt Method 2 regulations necessary to regulate fees, so existing or new, on regulated rental units. So just ones affected by this bill, not ones that aren't, like whatever exemptions you have, and set limits on fee increases.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification. I think that cleaned it up a little bit, and I will yield back to the President.
Councilmember Balcom.
Thank you. So can you just state the amendment?
So I'll let Ms. McCartney-Green she can read what I have and then make any more prudent language amendments.
I'm going to be clear so we have everyone that's following, because we had a lot of back and forth.
Yes.
And so bottom of page 6, top of page 7, Councilmember Mink had an amendment to regulation of fees. The proposal here now is to replace that amendment or amend that amendment with the language that says the director must adopt Method 2 regulations necessary to regulate fees on regulated rental units and set limits on fee increases.
So can you say it again? I'm sorry.
Sure, that's fine. We're replacing the language with the director must adopt Method 2 regulations necessary to regulate fees on regulated units or units within the scope of this bill and set limits on the fee increase. My understanding that limits is also in tandem of Council President Glass, who also mentioned a fee schedule as well, and so that may...
Would they be synonymous? Interchangeable?
I defer to the lawyers.
I guess again, the complexity is in what is in the regulations. So this doesn't necessarily state that if it is over the limit, whether there's any remedy that you, the director, can then approve something that is over the stated limit. And so that's just unclear in the amendment. And so I still go back to the complexity of, without seeing a regulation, I can't say one way or the other on where I stand on the bill.
And then for clarity, this just provides a framework. It doesn't provide the details that you're looking for.
Yeah, we've got a chicken and egg situation. I can't write regulations until.
And just to clarify or state for the record, a Method 2 regulation, once the executive develops it, it does come back to the council for review.
That's correct.
Councilmember Stewart.
Thank you. I just wanted to echo what the council president said regarding fees. I think one of the places that we probably receive some of the most questions from tenants is regarding fees and lack of clarity around what actually can be requested of them and how it can be increased. And I just want to thank the Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs for all your amazing work. And the handbook that you do have for tenants right now is just so vital for them understanding what can and cannot happen. And I think adding this language to this bill and moving forward with these regulations is important, not just as we're talking in the context of rent stabilization, but just overall will be usually helpful for people who rent in our community. So I just want to say I will be supporting this amendment.
Thank you. Councilmember Katz.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I too am going to support the amendment, but I'd like some clarification. If WSSC goes up 7%, which we've approved, which we agreed with, do you automatically have to, as part of your regulations, go back and say whatever WSSC is charging, you can go up 7%? Or does each individual landlord, each individual property owner have to come to you?
No, they wouldn't have to come to us. So I'll go back to my two examples of the different types. If it's a master metered building, then the landlord is going to have to absorb those. And if they are not able to absorb those and keep their net operating income at an adequate level, then they could file a fair return petition to get an increase on all the rents. Or, you know, they do have the CPI +3, and so many landlords, if you look as the, you know, like the statistics everybody's mentioned already, that over the past 30, 40 years, it's been an average of 3%. Over the past 10 years, it's been an average of 2%. CPI +3 would pretty much almost always allow the landlord more than has been the traditional average. And so there is some, because CPI is set by changes in your local economy, which include utility prices and things like that. And so there may be a slight lag time between an increase and the CPI calculation annual, I mean, the one we use annually. And so that will help the landlord to make up the difference in something that is going to be spread, you know, beyond just them, the utility increase. But if they are not able to do that, then they can go to a fair return. On the cases where tenants are paying their own utilities, if they're individually metered, then the tenant would just have to deal with that on their own. The landlord wouldn't be affected. To the egregious example mentioned by Council President Klass, I would need to know more about what kind of strange contractual arrangement was done between the landlord and a third party to understand that, to be able to speak to that specific example.
And on that one, I thank you for your explanation. But on that one, because that person would be in the city of Gaithersburg, it wouldn't be part of this legislation anyway for the sub-metered. And if it's sub-metered, doesn't that mean that that person is paying the amount of electricity or whatever it is that they're actually using? If the meter is from Pepco, is that correct?
Yes, you know, sometimes meters are wrong, but you know, like theoretically, that's the way it's supposed to work. That if you're individually metered, you're paying just for the energy or water, you know, source that you're using.
So it really does need to be investigated in several ways, including our friends from the state. And then what happens if right now someone is renting an apartment and cable, it was mentioned about cable's included. And then the landlord, because we're doing all of this, says, you know what, I'm not going to include cable. If you want cable, you can go to, you know, to the individual cable provider. What happens in that case?
Do you mean currently or
under this legislation?
Oh, under this legislation, that would fall under whatever regulations we're going to promulgate. And in consultation with industry members, with landlords, as well as tenant advocates, we will need to devise an equitable solution where a landlord is charging for something as part of base rent. It's, you know, it's just included in your rent, not itemized out or anything.
Right.
If they're charging for something, and then they discontinue it. And we'll make it something that I'll give you an example. Say your building has a laundry room. And I experience this many times in DC. Your building has a laundry room, you pay for that service as part of your rent. Landlord decides for whatever reasons to discontinue use of the laundry room. What happens then? You're paying the same amount but not getting the same. And so that's something that we'll have to try to deal with equitably in talking with stakeholders and developing the regulations.
Okay.
I do want to note, Councilmember Katz, that there are some fees that are actually regulated by state law. So we don't want to get to, and mention cable, I'm not going to go too far into that, but certain fees are germane to just a property, parking, biking fees, but do the regulations make sure that if it's regulated by the state, it's not something obviously the county would be able to adopt in its regulation.
Well, but in my concern was that whether whoever's regulating what cable's charging, it was whether or not it was already a part of when I rented my apartment, and versus that the landlord says, look, I'm just not going to provide it anymore, for a variety of reasons. So you've answered it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Albornoz.
Back to the state preemption issue, do we need to include language in the amendment that sort of explicitly states that there are state preemption issues or not?
I don't think I think if it's clearly laid out in the state law, then we are directly preempted, so that's not necessary for us to list in our regulations.
I would say that, we could choose to identify those in the regulations just as a guide, because many landlords use regulations as a guide, and so we could specifically note state issues that they, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, that supersede any county regulations.
I want to note that the lease is the contract between the tenant and the landlord, and the lease is usually what dictates the fee upon signing, and so that's the basis to look from. Then obviously as a guide, if there are additional fees that are outside of the lease, then those are things to also look at.
Right. And I want to make go back to the distinction between a comprehensive fee that everyone's required to pay and a voluntary fee, such as the electric charging station or a gym membership or something like that. And we would, I don't think, somebody may tell me, give me an example where I would have to rethink, but I don't think we want to regulate voluntary fees. We don't want to tell somebody how much they can charge for the kilowatt hour for charging your car or something like that, as long as it's not something required that's required to live there.
Does that need to be in the regulations that come over, or should we include that language in the initial amendment that we're discussing right now?
Since I don't think I'm omniscient, I wouldn't necessarily say put it in the law, but I think we should look at putting it in the regulations if we don't find any contrary examples to what I just said.
I think council staff would appreciate the opportunity to take a look at it before putting it either in the bill or regulations. Whether or not it should be voluntary or type of fees that we're looking at.
Take a look at whether we should include it right now, or?
No. Whether or not we mention the regulations. So my recommendation would not be to include it here. I mean, we've set the framework here for regulations, but the question is whether or not should the regulations take into effect voluntary fees or mandatory discretionary fees. I would like the opportunity to take a look at that to see what that would look like before agreeing to that here today.
Okay. We could repeat one, maybe not last time, but one more time, what the amendment is at this point?
The director must adopt Method 2 regulations necessary to regulate fees on regulated units and set limits on fee increases. So I could break that down, and sorry for the overuse of the word regulation. So we'll be regulating fees. Regulated units would be only rent stabilized units. If you have an exemption from rent stabilization because of, say, a rolling new construction exemption or anything else, this would not apply to you. It's just for regulated. And so we will set up regulations on that, and then we also will have the ability to set limits on fee increases.
Okay. I don't know how long it will take for you to develop the regulations and come back to us. I know it's probably a matter of months and probably not until the fall, because we only have one more session before the end of this term is up. But what do we tell property owners in the meantime? How would you communicate to them? Because we're slated for work session and action today. We're going to be voting on this today. And so how would you advise them on the issue of fees based on this amendment between now and when the regulations, which still have to be reviewed by this body, and that may take more than one session, what would your message to them be?
I defer to Ms. McCartney Green because that deals with the timeline for implementation, and so.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things happening here. One, this bill will set a cap on the base rent. But when it comes to regulation of fees, that will be further delineated in regulations. There may be a cap, there may be a fee schedule, my understanding in terms of the type of fees that would be regulated. And so that is not, my understanding is not being determined today. It's setting a framework. And so for landlords that are listening, there are those that do have a base rent, and through utilities, whether it's mandatory or whether it's discretionary, those fees the department would look at. Now there's an opportunity for the department to approve those fees if they are deemed necessary or looking at a fair return. And so that's my understanding of the proposal here today is having some type of regulation on fees that are over and beyond.
But this doesn't impact fees for now until we receive the regulations.
Correct.
Okay.
Councilmember Mink.
Just wanted to appreciate the discussion and note that I think that I'm really just looking to do something that's reasonable here and to prevent something ridiculous from happening. So I think that we're actually all aligned in that goal. So I trust us to be able to come to a consensus when DHCA comes back with sensible regulations that are based on research and capacity. I'm not out here trying to pull one over on anybody, and I don't think anybody else is either. So, yeah, I look forward to having something reasonable in place. Thanks.
Thank you. Vice President Friedson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. A point of clarification. The transition clause that we agreed to already is the requirements of this act must not apply and must not be enforced until the Method 2 regulations required under the act take effect. That means everything. So I want to be clear because I think there has been some misunderstanding about how that works. Nothing that is approved here, based on what is before us right now, there could be amendments to change that later in this conversation, but nothing is in effect until the regulations are in effect. And that includes fee regulations, because this transition language is very clear. So because that's different than what was just said. So I just want to make sure, in response to Councilmember Albernaz's question, so we're all in agreement there.
That's correct.
Okay, because there was a differentiation between the fee dynamics in the response to Councilmember Albernaz's question and the rent provisions, the base rent provisions. And under the transition clause, there is no difference. Anything that is kicked to regulation, nothing in the act would take effect until the Method 2 regulations, all of them that are required under the act, are approved by the council.
That's correct.
Okay. That was not clear. I just wanted to make that very clear. I'll yield back to you, Mr. President.
Could I just make one little comment? No, I'll leave it there.
Councilmember Jawando.
And just very briefly, that is correct. And also under current law, you can't increase rent without 90 days notice. So,
And only once a year.
yeah, and only once a year. And so the idea of the lining up of what we're going to do later with when the regulations are going to be done, the intent is to have all that line up. So yes and yes. All right.
Very good. So we have a motion before us, an amended motion limiting the increases of fees through Method 2 regulation. All those in favor of the motion? And that is 8. All those against? 8-3, the motion passes. Okay. Next is an amendment I would like to put forward, and that is an amendment regarding banking. The bill, as proposed, limits rent increases to CPI plus 3%, but it is my fundamental belief that most landlords or good landlords are going to do what they have to do to keep their tenant, and are going to limit rent increases to whatever the costs might be for that particular year. And so there are going to be probably many, many more instances where a landlord does not increase rent to the maximum of CPI plus 3, as currently allowed in the law. But over the course of a tenancy, things might happen and there might be a need to increase the rent because of unforeseen circumstances, because of other changes that might have happened. And for the landlord who has been what I would call a good landlord by limiting rent to as low as possible, I think they should be able to bank that differential and to be able to use it if necessary at a later point in time. And so this amendment would allow that. And I think it is an incentive for landlords to be good landlords and allow them the flexibility if they need to increase rent at a future point, recognizing that they had, for a very long period of time, limited rent for the tenant's benefit. So I would like to move this forward. Is there a second? Seconded by Councilmember Lutke. Councilmember Lutke.
Just a quick question. I support, obviously I just seconded your motion, but there appears to be an extra word in here. So the definition of banked amount says means the dollar amount of an annual bank rent increase, and I think bank shouldn't be there. It just should be the dollar amount of an annual rent increase allowance that a landlord did not use to increase the rent for a regulated unit. Is that correct?
Councilmember Lukey jumped ahead. Yes, there's a
All right.
clarifying amendment to
All right.
remove the word, after annual, the word bank should be struck from that.
Okay.
Friendly
That was
amendment.
it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Accept that change. Thank you. Councilmember Stewart.
Thank you, and I want to thank Council President for moving this forward. As if people read ahead in the packet, they know I have also a banking provision, but I'm going to offer an amendment to the Council President's amendment, so maybe we can get rid of mine and move through this a bit quicker. So the amendment I would like to put forward has two parts. In the first line, to add new leases. So it would say, except as a provider under subsection B upon a lease renewal or new lease. And then also to add under a cap of 10%. Because at the moment there is no cap on this. And as we were talking about before, making sure that residents had predictability and knew what the possibility of their increases would be each year. And so basically on the first part of suggesting adding new leases, what will that do? Well, that provides guardrails on how much a landlord can raise the rent when the unit is vacated. And this is key for Montgomery County because we do not have just cause eviction. And we know from the excellent OLO report, which points out that jurisdictions with rent regulations but without added tenant protections may find some landlords will attempt to end a lease with an existing tenant to raise rents. To do so, landlords legally evict tenants, raise rents to unaffordable levels for existing tenants to force them out, or fail to renew a lease set to expire without cause. In addition, the impact statements we have on the economic analysis as well as the racial equity and social justice impact statement all recommend that as we move forward with this bill that we include some type of guardrails and vacancy controls. And I know this is a balance, and we've talked about those balances today, and we need to be thinking about how we put these guardrails in place and make sure that our good work here in creating stable predictability for renters is not undermined by some of the specifics here. So I would move forward that we add new leases and a cap of 10 years, 10% increase.
I appreciate Councilmember Stewart's amendment. I do not accept it at this time. The reason I don't accept it is because the intention of this amendment is to support tenants who currently have a lease and an agreement with their landlord. As I understand the proposal, it is to extend that beyond the current leaseholder, and I think that is a different issue, and I don't want to muddle the merits of banking on their own. And I know there is a proposal for vacancy control, and I'd prefer for that to be a separate conversation. Does anyone want to move Councilmember Stewart's motion? No? Okay. But,
Wait.
I just thought it was an offer to amend your motion.
and I
Right.
rejected it, so
Right,
unless
so-
somebody
Somebody
wants
has
to
to
second
second.
it, it could then be put on the table for consideration.
Okay.
If
thought we
I
had to
if I
deal with the
accepted
current
it,
motion
then it would be accepted.
Right.
first. But
Pardon me?
I thought we just had to deal with the current motion first since you didn't accept it.
I didn't accept
Accept
it,
it.
so unless someone wants
Someone
to
has to
second
second
it
it.
and put it on the table, then we can discuss it as an amendment to my amendment.
Sure.
I'll second
Okay, Councilmember Katz seconds it. Councilmember Katz, you're next in the queue.
it. It wasn't for that. It wasn't for that purpose. My question is there a different term other than banking? You know, this term, most people do not consider banking when they're thinking of rents. And so is there another way we could, I have no problem saying what we're saying, but saying it in a different way. And Scott, I know you've had to think a lot off the top of your head, and wordsmithing doesn't have to be right this second. But I do think we should look at something possible.
Preserve, I'm trying to think of synonyms that, like preserve
Well,
or
it's like
carry
an
over,
escrow
or-
almost, but
Well,
it's,
it's a
you don't want to
carryover.
do,
It's a carryover.
whatever it is. I just think somebody says, well, they're going to bank it, and it looks like they're taking that money and putting it in a place, and that's not what we're doing here. You're holding that, yeah. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilmember Mink.
Synonyms.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I support this. I support this amendment. I think that it's important that we have these pieces, and this is, I think, a sensible place to put it. Although where they ultimately end up, I'm kind of indifferent on. But this seems like a sensible place to put it. We're here, having some kind of having vacancy control is really, really essential for making rent stabilization work in a place that does not have just cause eviction protections, especially. We have seen that it increases housing stability, which is really essential. It has been found to increase diversity. This was actually one of the, this was the top recommendation from the Racial Equity and Social Justice Impact Analysis was to add vacancy control. So that's really essential. And then having some kind of limit, I think, is also important. And you know, this is, I think, the 10. It sounds like that's a compromise place. I'm sure some would like lower, some would like higher, but we're finding a middle ground, and I can certainly respect and support that. You know, we have all said here that some kind of limit is important. We don't want to be doing constructive evictions. We don't want to be, you know, we need some kind of ground rules here, and some kind of predictability. And you know, if once the landlord builds up too many points, then we lose that. And so having some kind of guardrails is important. So yeah, I'm going to support this amendment, and thank you.
Before I turn it over to colleagues, I will remind everybody that there is another amendment proposed immediately after this that specifically is about vacancy control. And as I noted, I did not accept this amendment because I wanted to decouple the two issues. Councilmember Jawanda.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. I think the issue I'm dealing with is not knowing how that's going to go, you know, because I wouldn't be in favor of this amendment personally unless I knew we were going to add vacancy control, because the banking idea is one that we already included fair return, and that takes care of one set of things. Banking as a concept is a good concept. We discussed it in the previous bills. As long as you don't get too high with the rate, and you know that's the whole thing here. And I think the cap of 10%. Again, this would mean, I always like to explain this for folks. If you raised it 2% a year for 5 years, and then that was a reasonable increase, but you were allowed to go higher than that, you could accrue those banking, and then in the 5th year, raise 10%, which is not ideal, right? Again, and not something that we want to encourage. So I think this is at the outer limits. This is really, you know, what was discussed earlier. This would just be protecting folks from the really exorbitant double-digit increases. Again, a little higher than I would like, but I think a compromise in this context. And so I I will support the amendment as well, just because it's really critical. It was pointed, and we have OLO and folks here, how important it is to have this type of protection on the back end, while ensuring that we get a fair return for our landlords. And again, I think Director Bruton, I just did want to ask you, as you understand this, do you just talk about the banking in this context? Did I explain it correctly about that example I just gave?
Yes. Just, if you'd like me to restate, if a landlord is allowed under this bill CPI +3 with a maximum of 6 on an annual basis. If they choose not to take, say, if CPI was 2 in a particular year, 2 + 3, 5, and the landlord decided to only raise the rent 3%, they would be able to bank the dollar amount, not the percentage, but the dollar amount of that differential, and then hold that over under the proposal that I understand from Councilmember Stewart, and with the amendment from Councilmember Glass or Council President Glass, that you could hold that for an indefinite time, and you could use it whenever you'd like, up to a total dollar amount not to exceed 10% of the existing rent. I don't know if I even simplified what you said.
No, you just said it in a different, more of a technical way, but it sounded the same. So while I appreciate the amendment proposal, I will support this amendment to the amendment, and that will determine whether I support the underlying amendment, but appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice President Friedson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Appreciate it. I would prefer that these two issues be taken up separately as well, and won't be supporting the motion. I did just want to note my own personal view on this. There was a request early on, even in the initial bill, at the higher rate for banking or carryover, whatever you want to call it. I was not supportive of that. And I was not supportive of that because the intention of the original bill was to set a point at which it was unreasonable under any normal circumstances for the rent to exceed that number for an existing tenant as part of the stability of that tenant, that family, that individual to have to absorb. When this current proposal was before us, my view has changed because we're at a much lower number, and that is a much different approach to this issue. And so I do think allowing for banking where you're not, or carrying over where you're not incentivizing annual smaller increases in order to prevent the kind of truing up to the market with a new tenancy was a more desirable outcome. I personally think that the vacancy challenge is a very significant issue. And yes, it solves some of the problems that have been cited in rent control that disproportionately help whiter, wealthier, older, better connected people. And the data does show that in strict rent control regimes. One of the ways to address that is by implementing some type of vacancy control. The challenge is that also creates another consequence, which is that it actually does have an impact on building housing. And that is in the OLO report as well. So it speaks to the nuance and the challenges of this issue. I'll note that I was not for banking. Originally, I would be for a clean banking amendment here, but I will not support the two issues combined, but appreciate colleagues for their consideration. I'll yield back to you, Mr. President.
Councilmember Alvarez.
Sorry to do this, but can we restate the amendment again? And just because I want to make sure I've got my brain around this. The one presented by Councilmember Stewart. Because I was prepared to support the banking provision, and we're conflating the two issues, and they're related. So, but I just need to hear it again.
Sure, and we're under number 4, banking provision, and so the proposal by Councilmember Stewart is to, 1, amend the not only upon lease renewal, but also including a new lease. A landlord would be able to bank, or we'll consider other language as well, the amount of the base rent plus the base rent plus the rent that's allowed under the allowance plus any bank amount. And we went through a scenario where anything over the allowed amount, they could bank that percentage. What we're also saying here is that there's a cap on the amount of the banking, and that could not exceed 10%. In addition to the cap, we didn't get to that, but the language is also here on how to use the banking and how that should be used throughout the year. Did I miss something there, Councilmember Stewart?
No, that's it.
Okay.
So we're putting new leases. We are also including, you're able to have a cap on that banking amount up to 10%. It was one example that was given, that if a landlord decided to increase it by a certain amount that's under the allowance, that they could bank that throughout. There's a maximum of 5 years. After 5 years, you could not continue to bank or use that bank amount. Sorry for lack of terminology. I know we use carryover and reserves.
I did not move that. Yeah, that's not,
That's a future amendment.
that's a future.
Yeah.
And I was trying to simplify things so we didn't have to deal with it second. So what this is that it would be upon a lease and a new lease. So really thinking about the intent here is if we're going to move forward with rent stabilization and talk about it as we have been talking about it, from my perspective, it's important for the individual tenant to make sure what's year to year. But if we're talking about looking at affordability across our community and looking at making sure that because we don't have just cause eviction, people aren't pushed out, banking is important, but so is having some guardrails on what a new lease can be. And so trying to think about that in the broadest terms. And then also just thinking about, as we've had this conversation and was stated in opening statements about not making sure, I think all of us agreed that rental increases were not moving into those double digits for any person in a given year, and so that's the cap of 10%. Even though technically that's double digits, but that seemed to be where the consensus was moving.
Okay, that's helpful. I'd prefer that the two issues be separate. I get and appreciate the intent for simplicity, but I still have questions regarding the vacancy control, and I'm concerned that will conflate with the amendment before us. So I won't support your amendment, but that doesn't mean I won't support the amendment. I want to go back to it.
Thank you. Councilmember Sales.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand who will monitor how much a unit has banked and used, and how will this information be shared and tracked?
So, in most rent stabilization programs that exist in other parts of the country, locally in other parts of the country, reporting is complaint-based. And so, there are two different ways that we can get at this. One, when we set up the computerized system for landlords to input the rents, we will also have a public-facing portal, so tenants will be able to look up the past and current rents, and tenants will be able to see these increases. And so that will facilitate a complaint-based approach to administration. And that I can promise we'll, make our best efforts to do. What I can try to do is, if since Thames is going to be working on this, we can try to make it so that we can have algorithms that would recognize what's been banked, like the difference between allowable and what was not taken in the past. But that is a more complex thing, which I don't know if we can do or not. And so we would probably default to the complaint-based structure, which is what's used in others, and that's up to a tenant to recognize it and to report it to us, or to report it to the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs, or to report it to the landlord, but the landlord's management agent may have made an error, and they may want to correct it on their own.
Okay. And so Councilmember Stewart's amendment is capping the banking at 10%, whereas Council President Glass would not have a cap.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Mink.
Thank you for the clarifications. And yeah, for me, I completely understand for folks who would rather have the issues separate if you're comfortable supporting the banking, but not some aspect of vacancy control. For me, it's really important that we have parity between the protections in vacancy and in renewal. That's what makes all of this flow and work well, and make sure that we're providing adequate protections. And so, for me, it's going to be important that if we're going to do this banking, that we are assured that it's going to come with those applications during both vacancy and renewal. So I would not be comfortable moving forward with this amendment without the amendment that Councilmember Stewart has proposed.
Councilmember Lutke.
I have a quick question on your original amendment. So as I understand it, if this applies, if this passes and we vote for what I call the unamended amendment that you have proposed, then each new lease for a unit, the banking tolls anew. It starts over because it is a new agreement with a new tenant, correct?
That was the intention. Not that this could roll over indefinitely.
Right.
That was never the intention.
Right. Yeah, because
So-
new tenant.
Yes, sorry, we had to just confer. The Council President Glass's original amendment you would start over with the signing of every new lease.
With every new lease or new tenant? Those are different things. I could be in a unit and sign a 2-year lease, and then at the expiration of the 2-year lease decide I want another 12 months, but I'm the same tenant and there may have been banking then.
It's a lease renewal, and just for clarity, lease renewal for Councilmember Vice President Glass, and for Councilmember Stewart, it's lease renewal plus a new tenant, new lease agreement. I'm sorry.
Right. So it's right. Let me back up because I think you're misunderstanding my question. What I'm saying is I know that the banked amount could apply if they chose to at each new lease renewal of the same tenant. What I'm getting at is the legislative intent of the council president in making this amendment or proposing the amendment would be that when I as the tenant move out after however many leases I have had and lease periods where there's been a banked amount that was available, if the landlord didn't expend that banked amount on me, that tenant, during my tenancy, however long it may have been, when a brand new tenant moves in, the banking starts to toll anew because my prior banked amount that they didn't use on me is not the same as what would occur because it starts fresh with a new tenant. That's not spelled out in here, but that's why I asked the question, because I wanted to make sure there was opportunity to provide that clarity, because I do think that's critical to this issue.
That's correct, Councilmember Lukey. And so if you did not use the banking with the current tenant, you would have foregone the opportunity to do that if there's a new tenant that moves in.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
And so let me just jump in here and explain a little further the intention and the reason that I did not accept the amendment. So by adding new leases to this amendment, my colleagues have essentially said that it is trying to apply the vacancy control and tie it to this. The other term that has been used is just cause eviction. This body, all of us are in support of just cause eviction. We have told our state delegates and our state senators that we support just cause eviction. People should not be forced out of their home for any willy-nilly reason. The mood of the landlord. If they are good tenants, they should be able to stay in their home. We are unanimous in that. The problem, as I see it here, is that if we apply vacancy control or in this case, new leases to this, this amendment, what is going to happen is landlords are going to raise the rent as high as they can because they will not be able to adjust it later. I'd like to OLO to come up and share with us what they found. And I know it's mixed. It's been alluded to that it's been mixed. This is not the legislative fix for just cause eviction. The only thing that can replicate just cause eviction is just cause eviction approved in Annapolis. The measures that we are talking about can work towards some goal, but there are other unintended consequences. I want there to be just cause eviction. I hope with new leadership in the House of Delegates, with a new committee chair, they might be able to move it, and with a new governor as well. But this amendment and vacancy control in general is not the same. Ms. Rubin, can you identify yourself, but share with us also the information about vacancy control that the OLO report has showed?
Sure. Leslie Rubin, Office of Legislative Oversight. In our research, there is one study that specifically looks at vacancy control and impacts. It's from 2000 out of the state of California. And what the findings showed was that on one side, it reduced the rate of rent increases, or let me clarify, in the jurisdictions in California that had vacancy control compared to looking at jurisdictions that either did not have rent regulations at all or had rent regulations but did not have vacancy control. And they were comparing data on those two different groups of jurisdictions. What they found was that there were reduced rates of rent increases in the jurisdictions that had vacancy control. There was decreased renter turnover, so people stayed in their units longer. And there was an increase in ethnic diversity. What they also found is that regarding the number of rental units in the jurisdictions, there was a decline in rental units in the vacancy controlled jurisdictions, and there was increase in the number of rental units in non-vacancy controlled jurisdictions. And there was a greater increase also in owner-occupied units created in the vacancy controlled areas, so suggesting that people were selling their rental units and they became owner-occupied, or owners moved into their own rental units. The researchers here and researchers in general do caution against extrapolating findings and saying, you know, this research study found this, and so that's going to definitely happen over here. That's not possible. But those are the main findings from the one study that looks specifically at vacancy control.
It sounds like it's complicated.
It's exceptionally
It's
complicated.
a Rorschach test, if you will, and you can extrapolate what you want. And there is no clear-cut result. Looks like you want to add something else.
So I did pull out, this is actually quotes from the researchers in that study. The rent control debate is highly politicized, emotional arena with an enormous amount of hyperbole on both sides. Our findings do not fully support any of the positions, and in fact show how complex the rental market can be. So I just want to show that is the researchers' commentary on the own findings of their research.
That is a quote for the ages. So before I turn it over to colleagues, I will again say my deep concern with this is that it will incentivize landlords to increase the rents as high as they can because they will not be able to recoup and reset the rent if a tenant is there for a long time. And the goal here is to encourage long-time renting, long-time stability, have someone in that rental unit for 5, 10, 15 years. And when they leave, they should be able to reset that rent. And because this will not allow them to do it in a reasonable way, that rent is going to increase year over year to the maximum allowed, and according to this bill, that is CPI plus 3. Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez.
Thank you. I'm going to start by saying that when I drafted my bill, which was joined by 5 other people, I specifically said I do not want rent banking. I don't want rate banking. In fact, and then when we talked about the vacancy control, I actually said in committee, I told the Council Vice President Friedman, let's not have a conversation on vacancy control in committee, should happen in full council. And the reality is that I walked into this meeting today saying, honestly, I came in with my mindset, I'm just gonna vote for Council President's Glass's banking provision as written. But I also know that I don't control what my colleagues say or do, I'm just leaving the moment. And for what I understand from Council Member Stewart, she's withdrawing her vacancy amendment and replace it with this one, which I didn't see coming. But I do think now we truly need to have that conversation on vacancy control. I had several questions, and I heard Council Member Albornoz saying that he also has questions on vacancy. I think you need to spell it out right now, because it's gonna be now. And since she's withdrawing her amendment, the issue that really made me pause, and my question is to Mr. Scott Bruton, is, and Councilmember Sales touched on this, is how can you regulate, like how do you know how much money the other person was paying? Because right now the only way to know is that when you take the tenant to court, right? Or you take the tenant to the landlord tenants board to create a resolution. So I don't want to pass something that it will be just bureaucratic. It looks nice, but nobody will be able to implement. So I need to understand, what efforts is your office going to be undertaking to ensure that this is actually something that will be enforceable. And at the end of the day, I know each one of us want to protect tenants, and we want to make sure that we're not empowering those bad actors out there, which are few, but they're out there, who are abusing our communities. So my question again, I'm sorry if I went too long, but I had to give that background, is to, based on what just happened now, walk us through vacancy control. How is it going to be enforced? How are you going to set up your office to make sure that happens? And I know already that you're overwhelmed. I just want to make sure this is not just something that looks nice and we say, yeah, we put it there, but it's not enforceable and it's meaningless. So thank you for that.
Sure. So to be absolutely frank and honest on this, the way that we will enforce it, at least initially, is through transparency. And this is transparency and complaint based. So this is the way the District of Columbia does it, the jurisdiction that I'm most familiar with. They are creating a rent stabilization database, but for decades they've had records at the Department of Housing and Community Development in DC, where a tenant can go look up what the past rents have been. And if they see that the past rents deviated from rent stabilization, they can they can file a complaint, and then the rents will be rolled back to what it would have been without the violation. For us, we want to make it easier than that. And so I mentioned before, we're going to create the computerized system to make it easier for landlords to register rents with us. But we'll also be able to do a public-facing side of that, where tenants will be able to see what the rent history has been on the unit, and so they will be able to bring to our attention. Now, that is the best way we have to do it now. If we can working with tabs, figure out algorithms or a way for our database to recognize differences that transgress the law, we will do our best to implement that. But I can't promise that because I don't have experience with that. I don't know if the technology exists for us to do that easily. And so the other is to have transparency and open records and allow tenants to notify us if they see a problem, and then we can Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs or depending on how staffing goes, the Rent Stabilization Office can handle those complaints.
Mr. Bruton, I just want to also make a point of clarification, and I'm cognizant of the time here. You referenced DC and how DC works, and there's just a number of things that we all need to acknowledge in the differences between this bill and DC law. DC law only applies to units older than 1975, it excludes homes, it excludes condos, and as it relates to vacancy control, they have greater latitude with what they are willing to allow. According to DC law, when a tenant vacates a rental unit, the landlord could raise the rent either 10% more than the rent charged to the former tenant if they stayed in the unit for 10 years or less, or 20% or more if the former tenant occupied the unit for 10 years or more. And then DC also allows up to 30% if the landlord can identify a comparable unit.
Correct, except for that last part. They eliminated it used to be 10% or 30% for a comparable unit, and they changed it to just the 10 and 20. So the comparable unit has disappeared because it was too many loopholes in it.
Very good. But again,
Yes.
as we are making our own comps to other jurisdictions, we need to be mindful of what all of that is. Councilmember Balcom.
Thank you. So, as many people said, that I think we were all looking at these issues separately, banking separately from vacancy control, and Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez mentioned that Councilmember Stewart has withdrawn the vacancy amendment. Actually, she merged the vacancy. So from Councilmember Sales, when she clarified what the amendment stated, it's not just the 10% cap on banking. This is vacancy control with a 10% cap. So I think it's just clear that that's what we're talking about. So I think that from my perspective from banking is without banking, there will be incentive motivation to hit the cap every year, and I think that is I think that will warp what landlords are trying to do. And we've talked this morning a lot about separating good actors and bad actors, and when we look at landlords who don't have that relationship with their tenants, the tendency is just going to raise it as much as they can raise it every year. But that's not the case. That's not what happens for many, many, many relationships between landlords and tenants. The landlords raise the rate, what they need to raise it to continue the business of renting a property. There will be a disincentive to continue that very close relationship between landlord and tenant, because the landlord, without banking, the landlord will be concerned about what happens next year or the year after that or the year after that. So I support the banking amendment, the original banking amendment, and I have great concerns about vacancy control. So my druthers would be to vote on these separately. That's not the issue anymore. So I can't support the amendment as amended. But I do support the original banking.
Thank you, Councilmember Katz.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I wanted to be clear. When we're talking about the 10% for the banking, is 10% overall. I believe that is 10% overall. It's not 10% plus the 6% that they could be, have increased. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So it's 10%. We keep using the term cap, but we also use the term cap for the 6%. But this is the overall cap, or whatever the right term would be on that, of the 10%. Yes. Okay. And I believe, and this, you know, I said earlier on that you know, this is a complex problem. This is a complex problem at every step of the way. But I think we almost need to revisit, and I know people don't want to revisit this ever, but I think we almost need to revisit this once we do get just cause eviction. Because I think that would change some of the concerns that we have on items like this. But until we do, and unless we do, then I think this is the best path forward. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. President.
Councilmember Joando.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Was one of my questions on my list. That this does not mean you can accrue past the 10. This would be in substitute of the 3% plus CPI in any given year. Is that correct? And does the current language reflect that? Do we need to be more clear about that?
Yeah,
I think we're fine with it. I mean, it's amending, adding that provision 3, any bank amount not to exceed up to 10%. I think that's
In any given year. I don't know if we said, but okay, you're including it in, it would be subsection, except as provided under subsection B, upon a lease renewal or a new lease.
Correct.
This is Councilmember Stewart. A landlord must not increase the rent of a regulated unit to an amount greater than 1, the base rent, plus 2, the rent increase allowance under section 2957, which is 3% plus CPI. 3, any banked amount capped at 10%.
Not to exceed 10%.
Not to exceed 10%. So that would, so good. So just making clear. So that in any given year, which is still a high number. So I just want to, you know, again, DHCA considers that constructive eviction. I think it's different in this case in that it would assume the only way you could do that is if you had been doing normal increases year to year and you accrued that high of a banking. So I think there's built-in protections into just how this is. I do also want to say that the 3% plus CPI capped at 6 already, the idea of why vacancy control will work in this sense will be different, already encapsulates the increases that are happening for the vast majority of landlords across this our county. Director Bruton mentioned over the last 10 years it's been around 2.1%. Over the last 40 years, I think you said, it's more like 3%. Again, both well under, and that's including everything. So I think this is more than generous in that regard. And then I just wanted to make a point about the compliance. I'll never forget knocking this young lady's door in Briggs Cheney and her son, and she had moved from a 2-bedroom to a 1-bedroom in the same apartment complex while we had stabilization, the bills that I had introduced and we passed, and it couldn't go over 2% because she got an increase of around 3.5%. For her, it was about $60, and she was working full time, single mom, couldn't pay that, wanted her son to stay in the same school, so negotiated with the landlord to move to a 1-bedroom when they slept in the same room, so she could stay in the same apartment. She had the protection. She didn't know. And obviously she knew what was going on because she had the wherewithal, like many people don't, to negotiate with the landlord to stay in her same apartment. So none of this is perfect. It's all compliance driven. Our job will be to get the word out and work with media and social and nonprofits and others. But none of these protections are good unless you know you have them. And so I think similarly to the overall cap, we're going to have that challenge the same way we're going to have the challenge with the vacancy control. I was just addressing some questions that were brought. Now we can try to get around it by posting it, having it be transparent on the website, the yearly reports, the surveys. There's a lot of ways to get at that, but it's going to be just as much of a challenge because you have to know you have the protection. So I just wanted to bring that up. So I think this is not perfect, but it is a good amendment. I will support it. Thank you.
Councilmember Mink.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to note that this is not a strict vacancy control amendment. This is a compromise position to ensure that we are not, to put some guardrails on, on what we're going to do during vacancy. But this is a compromise position, not strict vacancy control. And I'm willing to support that compromise. And I think that it's essential that we have vacancy control. Again, we have to have vacancy control attached to this because we cannot be letting these points accrue without some kind of limitation of what can happen during those periods of vacancy. Yes, it is hard to make sweeping judgments about different rent regulation provisions, as we have seen, but there is some consistency in the results that we see. We know that vacancy control helps to keep rents lower. We know that it helps to prevent turnover, that it helps keep people in their homes longer. Those data points are consistent across the research that we have currently available that's based on our most current research. We have several really good study points. The California study that was mentioned, they compared regions with comparable districts and comparable not just in like this one has vacancy control and this one doesn't, but they picked comparables that have a border each other, so they're that close to each other, and then where the population had certain similarities, so they could make comparisons that were as meaningful as possible. And this was still their finding, that we are going to help improve housing stability with vacancy control. Now, there were questions about why vacancy control might be correlated with the loss of some rental units, and whether the loss of those rental units in those particular studies, whether that was a causal link or whether that was linked to other, pieces of the rent regulations. There's still question marks about that. If we have low-income tenants who are being assisted by regulations in place to allow for condo conversions, which some of the jurisdictions that were looked at did have some ROFR protections, right of first refusal protections. I would say that's a positive thing. We want home ownership to be accessible to people who are currently renters. So if that is some of our transition from rental units to home ownership, which that same research paper suggested could be the case, that's a good thing. Something else that I think is important that we haven't talked about yet that's related to this issue. Vacancy control increases housing stability, and that matters for a lot of reasons. It's not just a moral imperative. Per the OLO report that we have on rent regulations, increased housing stability can result in many positive economic, educational, and mental and physical health outcomes. They gave several specific examples in that report that I think are very compelling. I'll give you just one of them: education. Housing stability leads to higher educational achievements for children, especially vulnerable children. Studies have found that for low-income students, changing homes even one time in elementary school can have a negative impact on school performance, contributing to a long-lasting achievement gap. Poorer children are much more likely to move multiple times compared to more advantaged children. Vacancy control has been shown to enhance housing stability. This is an equity issue in a lot of ways, and I would also note that housing stability has public safety implications. Serious public safety implications, not just with preventing homelessness and that kind of thing, but buildings and neighborhoods in which residents know each other and help each other and keep an eye on each other's kids are safer. So the reasons are many, and I hope that we're able to vote this through with vacancy control. Thank you.
Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez.
I have another question that I had it on the vacancy control amendment. Can you tell me, Mr. Britton, how does vacancy control relates to the fair return that is already on the bill? I am not opening the discussion on fair return. I just want to see how it relates on this. Let's say, I know we keep mentioning apartment buildings, but this bill includes single-family homes and it includes condos. So let's use the example of a single-family home, and let's say you have been banking, and then but you see, and then your tenant leaves, but you see that the home needs to have, needs to be repaired. How does fair return will apply here?
So do you want me to answer that under under Council President Glass's amendment, under Council
Yeah, because
President
this is what we're discussing.
We are entertaining an amendment to the amendment.
Yes.
Okay, so the amendment to the amendment under this, the 10% annual total cap on a rent increase using banking would provide some more pressure relief on drops in NOI or needs above what the rents have been. And so the banking will decrease the number of fair return petitions, but with the cap still, and 10% is a relatively high cap, that there still will be, if the banking plus the fair return or just using the maximum by itself does not adequately compensate a landlord to keep their net operating income from before, then they would be able to apply for a fair return to increase it above what the annual limit and the banking limit would be.
That's exactly where I was want to get to. Thank you.
Sure.
That was very clear.
Okay, final word this morning. This afternoon is going to be Vice President Friedson, and then we are going to recess. We will pick up this amendment after we come back.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. 2 quick points of clarification before we vote. One is we're going to have to take 2 votes on this amendment. There's an amendment to the amendment that is Councilmember Stewart's amendment, which is on vacancy control. That is the first amendment that we will vote on, and then we will vote on, if that passes, the amended version of Council President Glass's amendment, and if it doesn't pass, Council President Glass's original amendment. We talked about not wanting to conflate. There's an option to not conflate. You vote no on the first amendment and then vote yes on the underlying amendment if you want them to be together, because you don't want to vote on banking or carryover without knowing what the result of this amendment is. Then you would want them to be together. I just want to make sure, because people talked about that in different ways. I just think it's important that we know what we're voting on. Number 2, I just wanted to point out, based on the amended version that we are voted on now, Councilmember Stewart's proposal, if a landlord had hit the cap each year of a tenancy, that tenant moves out, a new tenant moves in, the new tenant, that new lease would be at 3 plus CPI, not 10. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that, because it adds in the new lease into the regulatory regime with no banked amount, because they wouldn't have carried that over. I just wanted to make sure that was clear, because it wasn't specifically discussed. The 10% number was discussed, and I just want to make sure we're all in agreement with that. With that, I will yield back to you for the vote.
Well, we're not going to vote right now because there are other colleagues who've signaled they have questions because of the underlying nature of the amendment to the amendment. And so what we are going to do now is recess. We're going to come back at 1:15 with a very special proclamation for a very special friend of the council. There are other legislative items that we will be taking up at 1:30. And then when we're done with those items, we will return to this and be here as long as necessary. We're in recess till 1:15.